Game of Thrones, The Wrath of the Sleeping Dragon. This video is purely for entertainment and does not infringe on copyrights or laws. The rights to the novel and image belong to the original author. We do not claim ownership. Don't like waiting and want to listen to this fanfic in full now? Subscribe to our Patreon, where you'll find the best fanfics. Chapter 401, Bravus Snowstorm. A light snow fell in Pentus. In Bravus, which is at a higher latitude and closer to the north than Pentus, a heavy snow fell. Snowflakes fell like goose feathers, and a thick layer of snow soon accumulated on the streets and roofs, and the entire stone city was covered in silver. Pedestrians who went out in the early morning and merchant ships that arrived in Bravus overnight were all amazed at this unprecedented heavy snow and the beauty of nature. How long has it been since Bravus had such a heavy snow? A thin middle-aged man who looked terminally ill said in a trembling voice. He was the contemporary Sea King of Bravus, Ferragantalion, who came to the open-air corridor of the Sea King's palace with the help of his chief swordsman, Quirrell Valentine. Feeling the coolness coming towards him, he crawled in through the gap in his clothes, and even couldn't help shivering slightly, and then coughed violently a few times. Lord Sea King. The chief swordsman quickly took off his cloak and put it on Ferragantalion. The heavy snow in Bravus came very suddenly. They haven't been so cold for many years, let alone such a large snowfall. This really caught many Bravus people off guard and unprepared, so they caught a cold and shivered. The Sea King of Bravus was already terminally ill, so he naturally couldn't stand such a cold wind. But what's interesting is that Ferragantalion has been sick for many years. Everyone knows that Lord Sea King is dying, and he might suddenly die one day, but although Ferragantalion is terminally ill, his life is very strong. Everyone is waiting for him to die, but he just hangs on to his last breath and doesn't swallow it. Then the weak Lord Sea King returned to his bedroom with the help of Quirrell. It was just a heavy snowfall that hadn't happened in many years. It was no longer interesting after a while, and the Sea King didn't take it seriously. However, a day and a night passed quickly. The heavy snow in the sky showed no signs of decreasing. Instead, it intensified and fell all over the place, even causing an unprecedented snowstorm in the history of Bravus. No one had expected such a thing to happen beforehand. The heavy snow kept falling from the sky, blocking the roads, freezing the narrow ship channels in the city, and crushing the houses in the slums. A large number of Bravus citizens who were poor and had no defense against the cold winter lay in bed and never woke up again. Needless to say, the homeless vagrants were frozen to death on the streets. Overnight, the entire giant city of Bravus experienced a terrifying white terror. A large number of citizens were frozen to death, and some were crushed to death because their houses were crushed by the heavy snow, or they fell into the water. According to statistics from the Bravus municipal officials, more than 10,000 Bravus people died overnight. There were also many tragic cases of whole families being frozen to death in the slums. The husband held his wife, the wife held their children, and the family of 3 was frozen to death in bed. This disaster in Bravus even killed several times more people than the fire in Andalus many years ago. Bravus suffered such a terrible disaster. While the city was actively providing disaster relief, rumors were flying everywhere. Some people claimed that Bravus had angered the gods, and perhaps it was a precursor to the doomsday disaster. Others claimed that this was related to the White Walkers on the other side of the narrow sea, because now the White Walkers have crossed the neck and are geographically opposite to Bravus. The latitude of the north of Westeros is higher, connecting to the land of eternal winter. The northernmost city on the west coast of the Essos continent is Bravus, and further north is the even more vast Shivering Sea. However, the unprecedented heavy snowstorm in Bravus is just a small episode after dinner for people other than the locals. Even the Bravus people themselves don't know the reason, let alone others. Viserys rode a dragon back to White Harbor, the main battlefield of humans and White Walkers across the sea in Bravus. He then ordered to abandon the port city. The dragon-riding Khal ordered all the Dothraki-roaring warriors in his Khals to board the warships of the Iron Fleet, bypass the neck and land on the land near the Three Sisters Islands in the Bight Bay, surrounded by the mountains of the valley. However, the mountain clans hiding in the mountains and forests seeing this group of Dothraki who were more barbaric and fierce than them, immediately behaved like good babies, just holding a pacifier in their mouths to act cute, and naturally did not dare to disturb this group of uncles landing, and slipped away. However, with this group of Dothraki, Viserys really picked up a treasure. When Viserys left White Harbor and flew to the main battlefield on a dragon, a group of wildlings quietly approached White Harbor, seemingly wanting to find a few boats to cross the sea from here. However, they were unlucky to run into the idle Dothraki, and then this group of wildlings were wiped out by the Dothraki. It turned out that when the White Walkers swept across the north, there were many people who could not escape to the south through the Bay of Kalin. They did not have the courage to pass through the extremely dangerous swamps, so they were forced to stay in the north. They hid in the dense forests, dodging the attacks of the whites, and then successfully got through. They thought that things would just pass, but later they discovered a crucial problem. That is, the winter enveloped the north, and heavy snow was flying all day long. Many trees were frozen to death, and even food could not be found. They did not dare to enter the castle, where food was stored, because there must be a lot of whites inside, and most of them had weapons, but nothing could be found in the deserted village. Therefore, this group of wild men learned from their mistakes and finally decided to find a ship and prepare to escape by sea. Only then did they find White Harbor in a daze. Originally, they mustered up the courage to fight the White Walkers in White Harbor, but they encountered a more terrible enemy head-on. Then the group of wild men were killed, and only some prisoners were captured. And these prisoners are the interesting part. Viserys rode on his snow-white warhorse, holding the reins with one hand, while the black dragon Beliebrian circled in the sky. A large number of Iron Fleet warships came ashore, and the Dothraki people walked down from the warships, leading their warhorses. Among them were 2 huge cages, and dozens of iron men dragged them with ropes, and rolled them off the ship. The monsters trapped in the cages roared, and they were still pounding the iron cages with iron chains on their hands and feet. It turned out that they were 2 giants. Chapter 402 Giant King. Additional update from the leader. The giants were extremely ferocious, which made the Dothraki people, who were known for their ferocity, feel defeated. However, the people on the grassland were not fools and naturally would not fight the giants head-on. The Dothraki used a roundabout tactic. They first killed all the giants' companions, and then successfully knocked down the 2 big guys through the clever tactics of hunting large prey. They tied them tightly with iron chains, and locked them in a cage for elephants. Viserys' blood-red Kago thought that the 2 big guys might be useful to the cow, so he kept them. Magmaz Tundodorweg. Viserys whispered the name, and a tall, grey-haired adult giant in the iron cage turned around, and looked at Viserys coldly. The one who was smashing the cage was a female giant, who looked a little smaller than this mag, about 12 feet tall, 3 meters and 60, and was also an adult giant. Not long ago, Viserys interrogated the captured wildlings. Fortunately, there are many wildlings who are proficient in the ancient language and the common language. They know the situation of the giants, and they confessed everything to save their lives. The wildlings have no king, nor nobles and commoners, but they all call Mag Giant King or Strong Mag, because he is the strongest warrior among the giants, with a height of 14 feet, which is more than 4 meters, almost reaching the limit of giants. And this female giant is Mag's queen, named Edda Marshend Doranelli, and the wildlings call her Gentle Edda. However, this gentle is obviously more of a joke than a reality. Edda looks more irritable than her king husband. The number of giants is extremely small, and many have been killed and injured in the battles with humans and White Walkers. The wildlings don't know if there are other giants, but when they were hiding and wandering in the north, they only encountered 2 of their giants. Perhaps the other giants have died. When he realized that they were probably the last 2 giants in the world, Viserys looked at them with an unusual look, as if he saw a first-class protected animal, and they were a male and a female. Giants are humanoid creatures, and obviously cannot be classified as humans. It is no wonder that even the Dothraki looked at giants with fear, because they were too tall. Viserys took the wildling translator and tried to chat with the Giant King, but the other party ignored him, which made Viserys feel a little frustrated. However, when the other party saw that Viserys could ride a dragon, his eyes widened slightly in surprise. It seemed that he did not expect that a weak human could control a monster stronger than him, which still made Viserys feel very interesting. Hey, want to make a bet, big guy? Gilulu. Viserys rode a warhorse, and the iron cages containing the two giants were placed onto carriages and pulled forward by several pack horses. The dragons were circling in the sky and roaring. The endless Dothraki army was moving slowly on the ground. Viserys followed the carriage and took the time to chat with Mago. If you beat me, I can let you go. If you lose, you must submit to me. Submission in the ancient language is not the same as in the common language. It is equivalent to recognize the elder brother, just like the giants were willing to help Mance Rayder, the king beyond the wall. The constraints are not as strong as those between the king and the subjects. He did not chat too much with gentle Edda. First, this woman has a bad temper, and second, her husband is next to her, so Viserys still has to avoid suspicion. However, although Mago's temper is not as bad as his wife, she has a problem of being taciturn. She seems to have accepted her fate and does not struggle too much in the cage. However, in Viserys' opinion, the other party has not accepted her fate, but is waiting for a suitable opportunity. Hearing the ancient language translated by the wildlings, Mag, who had grey and white hair, slowly turned his head. Compared to his huge head, his eyes were not big, but compared to normal people, they were still huge eyes. Mag's eyes were grey and black, and he looked at Viserys coldly, as if he was looking at a fool. He had never heard of any human who wanted to compete with him in strength. He could smash the little guy in front of him into a pulp with one punch. But this was a good opportunity for him to escape. Then Mag nodded slowly. Cal. On the other side, the blood guard Cargo who followed him was shocked when he heard that Viserys wanted to fight this big guy. But Cargo was not afraid, but took the initiative to express his willingness to fight this big guy on behalf of Viserys. According to the rules of the Dothraki, if a Cal is challenged by his own people, he needs to fight himself, but there are many exceptions. If some unknown juniors come to challenge the Cal will be very busy. But the Cal was provoked by an external enemy, and the blood guards should fight on behalf of the Cal. Cargo drew out his Valyrian steel arak and asked for the order to fight, but was stopped by Viserys. Os. The silver-haired young man turned his head and looked at his loyal blood guard. He wanted to fight the giant because he was sure, but if Cargo went up, he would really die. Viserys had a good learning ability, mainly due to his mental strength of nearly 30, and he could remember many things with a little attention. Now he has mastered 3 languages, the common language of Westeros, High Valyrian, and Dothraki. When he talks a few more words with the wildling translator, perhaps he can master some simple ancient languages. Blood of my blood. Hearing the Cal's order, Cargo could only lower his head and put the scimitar back and stood aside. The giant king, Mag the Strong, had been released from the cage, and his heavy footsteps fell to the ground. Who? The giant exhaled white air from his thick nostrils, and was slightly stretching his muscles, that had been tied up for many days. Although the surrounding Dothraki looked at the giant with some fear in their eyes, and they had indeed wasted a lot of effort in capturing the giant, but when they heard that KO was going to fight this giant personally, the atmosphere instantly became high. KO riding a dragon. Kill this big guy. Chop off his stuff and make soup. The Dothraki people, with oil paint on their faces and thick furs on their bodies to resist the cold, drew out the scimitars at their waists, raised them high to reflect the light in the sun, and let out piercing howls. Such a one-on-one battle can stimulate the adrenaline of the Dothraki people even more. Chapter 403 Recovering the Giant, thanks to GUI Miaing for the reward. Viserys also jumped off his horse. The chain of his sword made a sound. He was not wearing armor, but just like the Dothraki warriors around him, he only wore a thick fur cloak. In fact, the Dothraki were extremely disgusted with wearing armor, but the north was too damn cold, and these Dothraki who had never seen such a big scene were frozen to death. Their faces were pale, and they even shivered when they walked. Fortunately, John Connington had foresight. He had been the Prime Minister of the Seven Kingdoms and naturally knew the situation in the north very well. At that time, when the royal army planned to attack the north, they stockpiled a large amount of fur and cotton in order to prepare winter clothes for the soldiers going to the north to quell the rebellion. Unfortunately, the royalist army was defeated before it even reached the north, and these stockpiled supplies were useless. Later, they were probably looted by the Lannister army when King's Landing was captured. Now that winter has arrived, the north must be a hell on earth with ice and snow. As the Prime Minister, John Connington asked the Dothraki to wear furs and armor, but he encountered strong opposition from Cargo, because this was to destroy the tradition of the Dothraki people, and even went to his own Khal to complain. But John did not quarrel with Cargo, he had long expected this result. The Dothraki refused, but he hurriedly prepared enough furs, and asked tailors and craftsmen to make them into animal skin cloaks, with boiled leather armor lined in the waistcoat, and metal plates were equipped in some key parts for protection, which was a set of enhanced scale armor. Then these fur scale armors with warmth retention were brought to White Harbor by ship. Viserys knew about this, but he did not ignore the tradition of the Dothraki people, and force Cargo's warriors to wear armor. However, less than half a day later, Cargo came to the door on behalf of the vast majority of compatriots and carefully asked KO if he could wear something warm. Although the Dothraki were barbaric, they were not made of steel. They lived on the warm sea of grass all year round. How could they have seen such a cold and freezing situation? Therefore, these Dothraki warriors voluntarily put on the fur armor customized for them by John Connington, and regarded it as a treasure, and didn't want to take it off when sleeping. For the first time, the Dothraki experienced the benefits of armor. The cold wind in the riverlands was howling. Although there was no snow, the temperature was quite cold and the temperature was very low. Viserys was wearing a black suit, with a metal dragon head medal on his chest, a black and red cloak, a grey and white wolfskin cloak on his shoulders, and fine fluff fluttering in the wind. A long sword was hung on his waist, and a Valyrian steel dagger was on the other side. The giant King Mag was ready, and he raised his huge head, and looked at the little guy in front of him. Viserys stood in front of the giant without any fear. His lavender eyes looked very calm. He had seen the Night King, let alone a giant. Then he smiled slightly and nodded. Come on. Viserys spoke in ancient language. When he spoke, the giant Mag was slightly stunned. It seemed that he had not expected that he had mastered the ancient language in just a few days. But he did not think much about it. Now was the key opportunity for him to escape. Then he roared and rushed forward. Roar, the giant king, was as tall as 4 meters, almost 2.5 meters taller than Viserys. His huge body brought a very strong sense of oppression. However, Viserys had been with Balerion, who was dozens of meters long, for many years, so he did not feel any discomfort when facing the giant. Mag punched down fiercely, but was dodged by Viserys nimbly. The punch hit the ground and immediately raised dust. It's huge, but it's not slow at all. Viserys was slightly surprised. The Dothraki people formed a huge circle. They saw that their cows were not afraid of the giants, and they immediately raised their scimitars and cheered. The giant King Mag was angry. He changed his silent character not long ago. He hammered his chest angrily, and then pounced on the slippery little guy like a loach again. However, the silver-haired young man was very flexible. He almost played with the big guy in front of him and dodged again. The cheers of the Dothraki were even louder, and the wildling translator and the gentle female giant adder were almost dumbfounded. They never imagined that Mag would be played around by a weak human one day. The giant king tried desperately to catch the other party but in vain. Then Viserys did not draw his sword, but drew the Valyrian steel dagger at his waist, and rolled over, and stabbed him in the knee. Mag let out a deafening roar, knelt on one knee, but then fiercely opened his arms and hugged Viserys. However, the silver-haired young man rolled on the spot to dodge again, and then the dagger stabbed into his lower back again. The blood of the giant was all over the ground, and the Dothraki saw that the Khal had the upper hand, and was hunting this big guy, and the howling became more fanatical. Kill him. Kill him. Cut off his head. Peel off his scalp. They were looking forward to seeing a more bloody scene, seeing their Khal personally hunt down a huge wild man, and show his bravery. Unfortunately, Viserys stepped on the shoulder of the giant Mag, and the sharp dragon steel dagger was already against his neck. With just a little force, he could kill the giant in front of him, but his hand stopped in the sound of Mag's heavy and rapid breathing. You lose, Mag. The silver-haired young man spoke to the giant king in ancient language. Snap. Then Viserys put the dagger into the scabbard, but jumped off Mag's shoulder. The giant was so tall that Viserys couldn't reach his throat, even when he knelt on one knee. When Mag saw that Viserys didn't kill him, his heavy breathing relaxed a little. Viserys jumped off him. He clenched his fist and seemed to want to take this opportunity to kill the man in front of him with one punch. However, Mag finally loosened his fist. I lost, human. Mag's voice was as low as thunder with blood flowing on his body, and then he stood up from the ground tremblingly. But he didn't stand firm and knelt on one knee again, bowed his head slightly to Viserys, and expressed his surrender. In the 293rd year of the Egan calendar, the mighty Dothraki army rushed to the battlefield, allowing the coalition soldiers to see the terrifying barbarian tribe for the first time. After resting for a while, the White Walkers once again walked out of the neck swamp. Chapter 404, Twin City Defense Line. The traces of the White Walkers reappeared south of the neck, and the human coalition stationed in the Twins was intensively arranging fortifications. With the reinforcement of the Targaryens and the existence of the dragons, the determination of humans to unite against the White Walkers became even stronger, as if they saw the light of hope and even had the strength to work. This way. Bring that piece of wood over here. The soldiers wearing various types of armor and carrying their family emblems were busy working, making clanging sounds, and there was a scene of enthusiasm everywhere. They were strengthening the defensive fortifications of the Twins, determined to stop the White Walkers here. Hey. Thanks, brother. Then a soldier wearing northern fur armor patted a Lannister soldier wearing black and gold armor and a red cloak. It's okay. The Lannister soldier also smiled slightly, and the two nodded to each other, and then continued to do other work. At this time, open the door. The wooden barricade at the door was removed. Trample, tramp, tramp. Several knights rushed into the fortifications of the Twins. The leader was a young man wearing a grey wolfskin cloak, black clothes, a black and red cape, a long sword hanging from his waist, and riding a snow-white warhorse. Beside him were several Dothraki warriors wearing animal skin armor and cloaks. They rushed in directly, as if they had entered a no-man's land. When the soldiers of the Seven Kingdoms saw the newcomers, they immediately put down their work and looked at each other in confusion, not knowing what to do. Fortunately, there was a noble general who was supervising the soldiers to build fortifications. The commander of the Valley Army, Earlyon Royce of Runestone City, Bronze Yon. He was still wearing his ancestral heavy bronze armor. It was said that this set of bronze armor had a history of thousands of years and was engraved with magic spells that could protect the wearer from harm. Your Majesty. Earlyon Royce urged his warhorse to come forward. He had grey hair and a beard, a pair of grey eyes and thick eyebrows, and a thick hand holding the reins, looking very strong. He sat upright on the horse and bowed slightly. His voice was deep and powerful. In fact, the coalition did not dwell too much on this issue. After all, it was a battle between the living and the dead. If they still cared about these things at this time, the human race would be close to real destruction. The coalition called Viserys and Robert King to prevent the intensification of conflicts and hinder cooperation. Lord Royce. Viserys reined in his horse, looked at him and nodded slightly. Hula. Then the silver-haired young man turned over and got off the horse, and several Dothraki guards behind him also jumped off the horse. Although they were alone in the enemy camp, these Dothraki did not fear at all. They glanced at the surrounding coalition soldiers with a pair of fierce eyes, holding the hilt of the arak with one hand to protect the safety of their cowl. Lord Royce nodded slightly, and some soldiers of the coalition army came forward and took the reins of the war horses from several people. Then the old General Jon Royce also turned over and dismounted, raised his hand, and made a pleased gesture, and said in a low and humble voice, "Your Majesty, please. Your Majesty, Robert and the Dukes have been waiting for you for a long time." Lord Jon Royce's face was still a little sad. It turned out that the news of his feudal Lord Jon Arryn's assassination had been heard not long ago. King Robert was also furious and even wanted to lead his troops back, but was strongly stopped by everyone. Everyone knew that there must be something fishy about this. Jon could not have died at the hands of the mob as those people said. However, at this critical period, they had no way to return to King's Landing to investigate clearly. Once the morale of the coalition army was scattered, who in each place could withstand the attack of the White Walkers? The Riverlands and the Crownlands may be destroyed first, followed by the Westlands or the River and Stormlands. Although the Vale is easy to defend and difficult to attack, it can't resist the attack of the Army of the Dead. In the end, the Vale fell, and it was Dawn's turn. The rule of various families over Westeros ended here, and history was buried in the dust. From then on, there were no lions, no eagles, and no dire wolves. Therefore, although everyone was sad about the murder of Jon Arryn, they still understood what was more important at the moment. Death is like the extinguishing of a lamp. When Jon was alive, he could unite the 4 major families as the core hub of the alliance, but he was worthless after death. The living people still need to unite to fight against the more important enemies in front of them, and there will be another challenge that will devour the 7 kingdoms in the future. After the Dothraki army arrived at the Twins and built a camp not far from the coalition camp outside the city, Robert invited Viserys to discuss the battle plan together. And Viserys was not timid, but came to the appointment with several guards. The possibility of a hangman banquet was not absent. Everyone admired Viserys' courage to attend the meeting alone. However, what they didn't know was that Viserys was more confident that he could kill everyone present before they killed him. He could do it alone. Ta ta ta. The footsteps of the crowd were noisy, and Lord Jon Royce led the way in front. Viserys and several Dothraki guards followed him into the Twins. The atmosphere in the Free family's castle was a little depressing, mainly because of the tragedy that happened not long ago. Today's new Lord Free is Stevrin Free, the eldest son and first heir of Lord Walder Free. He is nearly 60 years old and even has grandchildren. When Walder was still alive, he teased him that Stevrin had waited for him to die for 40 years. Like Walder, Stevrin regards his family as very important, but the difference is that Stevrin is more gentle and rational than his father, but his ability is relatively insufficient. The other sons and grandsons of the old Marquis Walder were fighting among themselves, and they wanted to challenge the position of the new Marquis of Free. However, the coalition forces were approaching, and the princes and nobles sitting there, no matter which Free descendant, dared not make a move at this time. Instead, it unexpectedly helped Stevrin to secure the position of the head of the Free family. Everyone turned around the corridor and soon arrived at the meeting hall of the Twins. However, at this time, Jon Royce, who had been silent for a long time and led the way, suddenly spoke. These barbarians are indeed fierce, skilled in archery and horse riding, and killing is like a common meal for them. He stopped outside the door and turned to look at Viserys. But your majesty, are you really going to use these barbarians to conquer the 7 kingdoms? If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 405 Pre-War Meeting. The sturdy Earl of Runestone stood outside the meeting hall of the Twins, then turned around and asked in a low voice. Inside the room were all the princes and nobles, but Jon Royce had been holding back this question for a long time, but at this moment he couldn't help but ask it out loud. After all, not everyone has the opportunity to talk to the young Dragon Lord alone. The Dothraki guards standing next to Viserys looked at their Cal in confusion. Because they couldn't understand what the armored man in front of them was saying, it seemed that he mentioned them, but it didn't seem to have any hostility. Viserys stopped when he heard Jon Royce's words, and he looked at the old general in bronze armor in front of him. The other party also looked at Viserys without showing any weakness, but then he felt a palpitation for some reason, and then lowered his head slightly and looked away. Lord Jon Royce, my territory is twice as large as the Vale, and my people and soldiers are countless. Just as the mountain clans are nominally subject to Lord Robert Arryn, the Dothraki are also my people, and they are willing to respectfully address me as their dragon riding Cal. Viserys looked at the Lord of Runestone, who bowed his head slightly, and then spoke calmly. In fact, the Dothraki language simply calls Viserys the word dragon plus the noun Cal, that is, dragon plus Cal, which can be translated as dragon riding Cal or real dragon Cal, or even more simply dragon Cal. Then Viserys did not continue to speak, but nodded to Lord Royce, then pushed open the door, and walked straight in. Several Dothraki guards carried their axe, looked at Jon Royce, who looked a little ugly but said nothing, and then followed their own Callan to the meeting hall of the twins. Viserys suddenly pushed the door open and walked in. The nobles of the 7 kingdoms who were discussing tactics in the room suddenly became silent and looked at each other in confusion. There was silence for a moment. "Welcome, your majesty." Tywin Lannister, the Duke of Casterly Rock, stared at Viserys with his green eyes, and then took the lead in breaking the silence in the room. He raised his hands and clapped, then spoke. "Welcome, your majesty. Welcome, your majesty." Then the whole conference room was filled with sparse applause and welcome voices, and Eddard Stark, the Duke of Winterfell, also spoke. But Stannis, the commander of the River Each, Randall Tarly, and King Robert, who was sitting at the head of the sand table, did not speak. Facing the nobles of the 7 kingdoms, Viserys also seemed very calm, and his lavender eyes swept over everyone present. Everyone had different expressions on their cheeks, and the eyes looking at him were also different, with awe, fear, curiosity, and hostility. The people in front of him included Eddard Stark, Stannis, Tywin Lannister, Edmure Tully, Randall Tarly, etc. Viserys might not recognize their faces, because many of them were seen for the first time. But when Viserys was a child, he was taught by Daniel, a maester on Dragonstone. The first priority of learning was to remember the names, emblems and family languages of the major families in Westeros. He could recognize their identities just by looking at the emblems on their chests. Then King Robert, who was sitting in the first seat with a full beard, looked at Viserys and finally spoke in a low voice. "Welcome, Viserys." There was an empty chair next to him, which was obviously prepared for Viserys. Robert was the former supreme commander of the coalition, and now that Viserys was here, the two of them could not arrange a high and low seat. The coalition had many soldiers and nobles, and Viserys had dragons and Dothraki, so naturally they were on equal footing. "Please take a seat." Robert invited Viserys to take a seat, and Viserys did not act pretentiously. After looking around, he sat directly next to Robert. Several Dothraki guards, including his blood-ridder cargo, followed behind Viserys, holding erax in their hands and looking fierce. These people are all good fighters in the tribe. If the group of people in the room really fight, perhaps Viserys would not have to take action, and a few Dothraki would be able to make them pay a heavy price. "Go on." The silver-haired young man sat in the first seat and nodded slightly, speaking for the first time. Robert also nodded and glanced at Selwyn Tarth, the Earl of Duskfall Hall, who was speaking just now. The other party was one of the generals of the Stormlands. Selwyn Tarth hesitated for a moment, before continuing to speak. "Your Majesties and all the lords. Previous battles have taught us that we cannot win by facing the enemy head-on. Their numbers are too many, beyond our imagination, and they are tireless and never stop." Lord Duskfall Hall suggested defending the river. The Night King could freeze the river, while the dragons and kerosene could melt the ice. The Whites had no long-range weapons, while the human army had all kinds of bows and catapults, and several giant crossbows were also built. This was also a helpless solution. Many generals in the coalition nodded slightly, agreeing with Lord Selwyn's proposal. The main reason was that the White Walkers were too unsolvable, and they could not think of any better tactics. Dragon glass can kill White Walkers. I think you already know that. Viserys, who was sitting side by side with Robert, suddenly spoke at this time. All eyes in the audience looked over at once. "Yes, little Viserys. But the amount of dragon glass is too small." At this time, a trembling voice sounded from the corner. A white-haired old man was curled up in a chair and opened his white blind eyes and spoke. Except for the king, all the nobles present had seats, and even the dukes had to stand, so Viserys did not see the old man who was blocked by the crowd at first. "You." Now hearing his voice, Viserys was slightly stunned, and just as he was about to stand up from the chair, he was stopped by Maester Aemon. "Little Viserys, the pre-war meeting is important. We can talk alone later." Maester Aemon's voice was trembling, and Viserys sat down slowly after hearing his words. The many nobles present looked at each other, and saw the shock in each other's eyes. "Who is he?" This old man often appeared in combat meetings but rarely spoke. Some of them knew that he was a Maester of the Night's Watch, and some even didn't know who this person was, and didn't know his name or identity. But they didn't expect that this old man could actually call the young dragon master Little Viserys. And he was not angry at all, but seemed very respectful. Chapter 406 Assignment of Duties. Many nobles in the coalition meeting room whispered, speculating on the identity of this little old man. Why is he so awesome? And it seems that only Eddard Stark knows the true identity of Mr. Eamon. There are a lot of dragon crystals on Dragonstone. Viserys was shocked and slowly sat down with his hands on the table. He hadn't received a letter from this ancestor for a long time. He used to receive one occasionally. The last letter Mr. Eamon wrote to him was before the Battle of the Wall. However, the wildlings blew the horn of winter and collapsed the wall and fled into the Seven Kingdoms. Then the army of the White Walkers arrived, and the human coalition was defeated in succession at the Wall, Winterfell, and the Bay of Kalin, losing the entire north and fleeing all the way to the Twins. Viserys has not received a letter from Mr. Eamon since then, and he even thought that this ancestor had died in the subsequent war. After all, in such a chaotic era, it was extremely difficult for him, an old man of nearly 100 years old, with weak legs and feet and blind eyes, to survive. Viserys had not expected that the old man was still alive, so he was also shocked, and then he calmed down a little. On the other side, Stannis frowned slightly when he heard Viserys' words, raised his chin, looked at the silver-haired young man sitting in the first seat, and then said in a flat voice, "Your Majesty said that there are a lot of dragon crystals on Dragonstone? How come I don't know?" Viserys turned his head and looked at him when he heard Stannis' words. He didn't recognize Stannis' appearance. This was a man who was prematurely aged and had some bald hair. The thin circle of short hair seemed like a crown, and his face was indifferent and his attitude was meticulous. However, the other party had a crown stag emblem on his chest, and he seemed to regard himself as the Lord of Dragonstone in his words, so Viserys could not guess it easily. "Are you Stannis?" Viserys looked at him with interest, and Stannis nodded slightly with an indifferent expression. Then the silver-haired young man shook his head, sneered and said, "The Targaryen family knows more about Dragonstone than you think. Dragonstone is the dragon's birthplace of the Targaryen family, so he naturally knows more about Dragonstone than Stannis." However, Viserys did not explain in detail why he knew that there were very rich dragon crystal veins under Dragonstone, but just vaguely said that the Targaryen family knows Dragonstone. "But everyone, don't worry, I have arranged for workers to dig the dragon crystal mine day and night. I believe the first batch of dragon crystal will be delivered to the front line soon, and then we will have weapons to fight against the White Walkers." The silver-haired young man leaned on the back of the chair, with his left leg pressed on his right leg and his hands crossed, and spoke in a calm voice. When the people present heard his words, they were stunned for a moment. However, they were all well-known nobles in the Seven Kingdoms and naturally they were not fools. They reacted immediately. Everyone's eyes fell on Stannis, and they saw that Stannis' face was as uncomfortable as if he had eaten shit. He stared at Viserys, and his palm unconsciously pressed on the hilt of the sword. The Dothraki standing behind Viserys also noticed that the atmosphere was not right, and they immediately drew out their scimitars. KO. KO. These Dothraki people were fearless and even had fierce eyes. They didn't mind killing everyone present first, and then accompanying KO to kill out. The atmosphere in the conference hall was instantly tense. However, Stannis' breathing was a little heavy and rapid. He tightly grasped the hilt of the sword at his waist, and the veins on the back of his hand popped up, almost wanting to draw the sword. But after a fierce ideological game, Stannis finally admitted his weakness. He let out a long breath, let go of his hand, and lowered his head slightly. "Your Majesties and all the lords, I'm not feeling well, so I will take my leave now." Then Stannis took his aide, the Onion Knight Davos, with him. Davos also looked at Viserys curiously, and then hurriedly left the meeting room. Seeing Stannis take the initiative to admit defeat and leave, the nobles of the Seven Kingdoms in the room breathed a sigh of relief. Just at that moment, they even thought that Stannis was going to challenge this young dragon lord to a duel. Robert, who was sitting next to Viserys, was a little slow to react, but soon he understood. He was also a little worried that his stubborn brother would overturn the table directly and was about to speak to stop him, but fortunately Stannis was more patient and finally injured it and slammed the door and left alone. However, Robert was not a person with a good temper. he turned around and said to Viserys in an unhappy tone, "That's it, Viserys, no further." Dragonstone was lost, and although Robert was angry, there was nothing he could do now. Although Dragonstone is an extremely important island in terms of geographical location, and is the gateway to King's Landing, fortunately, the walls of King's Landing are tall and heavily guarded, and it will not be captured in a short time. He also warned Viserys not to go any further, otherwise the basis for cooperation between the two sides would be broken. At present, the biggest enemy for everyone is still the White Walkers, and Viserys did not comment on this. If he went further, it would be King's Landing. In fact, he had just received news from there that Rhaenys led the Golden Group to attack Dragonstone and quickly broke through Tidehead Island, completely controlling Blackwater Bay, the outlet to King's Landing. Both armies made independent decisions, but Viserys also told Rhaenys that he still needed the coalition forces of the Seven Kingdoms to work together to stop the White Walkers. It was difficult to rely on the dragons and the Dothraki alone, so he asked her to restrain herself a little, otherwise if she went too far, people would run away, and it would be troublesome. After Stannis left, the combat meeting was still being held, and then the commanders of each army were decided. The coalition changed the previous situation, where each noble led their own army alone, and the command was chaotic, and there was no way to form a joint force. Instead, they completely disrupted the division of cavalry and infantry, with each general leading the left and right wings of the front, middle and back formations, which made unified command and dispatch more convenient. The commander of the front formation was Lord Randall Tarley of Hornhill, while the commander of the middle formation, which was also the commander of all the infantry, was Robert Baratheon, and the commander of the back formation was Duke Tywin Lannister. The cavalry was divided into left and right wings to cover the main formation, and Viserys' blood guard Cargo was the commander of all the cavalry. As a nation on horseback, all Dothraki were masters of cavalry and were proficient in horse tactics. Cargo, who could lead 20,000 Dothraki, was naturally a piece of cake. At the same time, this was also a political trade-off. Cargo, as Viserys' representative, must control the military power. Eddard Stark, the Duke of Winterfell, and Stannis, who left the meeting, were assigned to Cargo's command. The cavalry of the major families of the Seven Kingdoms cooperated with the Dothraki to participate in the battle. Chapter 407, Escape from Death. Cargo said a few words in Dothraki with a cold look. Eddard Stark didn't understand, but he didn't complain. After looking at him, the man with long dark brown hair nodded slightly. Okay. After all, he had heard about the Dothraki people. This is a nation on horseback and everyone is an expert in cavalry, so he nodded and agreed. So far, all the main commanders of the coalition have been assigned. And Viserys is a very special existence in the formation, even more important than everyone else. He has to control the dragon fire, to burn the dead army, and even face the threat of the Night King alone. In name, he is the commander of the whole army like Robert. Soon after the meeting was dissolved, Viserys also took his guards and rode on his warhorse to leave the twins and return to the Dothraki camp. But he took one person away from the twins, that is, the ancestor of the Targaryen family, Maester Aemon. Maester Aemon was too old, so that people of the same generation as him had already died. He was 200 years before the Aegon calendar. He became the only lonely old ship in the new era, keeping his oath at the wall, without relatives, without friends, and only facing the white snow outside the wall. Now, after going through hardships, he finally met his few relatives in this world, but he was also the great-grandson of his younger brother Aegon, who was 3 generations younger than him. You look very much like Aegon. Your blood is also very pure. I feel the power of blood and fire from you. Maester Aemon, with a pair of white blind eyes, touched the outline of Viserys' cheek with his hand, and roughly knew what his great-nephew looked like. Aegon V was Aemon's younger brother. He had long silver hair, a tall figure, and a very handsome face. It was rumored that he was born with the temperament of a king, and even attracted his sister and sister to take aphrodisiacs to compete for him. Then Aemon spoke tremblingly. Young Viserys, have you married yet? Viserys knew that the Aegon that his great-grandfather was referring to was Aegon V, his great-grandfather, and not the young Aegon whose identity was yet to be confirmed. He nodded and said, "Not yet married, great-grandfather. But he's already engaged, and his fiancée is a princess of Dawn." "A princess of Dawn? Is the engagement made because of the alliance?" The old man sat in a chair and listened to Viserys quietly, then asked. Viserys was silent for a moment, then nodded. "Yes." Then he saw the white-haired old man in front of him, with his toothless mouth open, laughing hoarsely, and then speaking. "You did the right thing, little Viserys. Since you have inherited the throne, you must kill the boy in your heart. Remember, to kill the boy in your heart, you must marry a wife of suitable status, not a wife you love, or who loves you. But in order to maintain the stability of the kingdom, it is an ancient tradition for our family to marry Dawn." The Targaryen family and the Martell family of Dawn were originally enemies who were on the verge of a fight, but they did not expect that they would become deep-rooted allies in the later period. The reason is that the marriages between the two families are extremely frequent, and almost every few generations of kings have a queen from Dawn. My grandfather is Daeron II, my grandmother is Princess Miriam Martell of Dawn, and my mother is also from Dawn, Diana Dane of the Dane family, who married my father Mika. Mr. Eamon's voice trembled, and he even had some difficulty speaking, and occasionally he had to stop and take a few breaths. However, the old man still chattered, as if he had a lot to say, and Viserys listened patiently, and learned a lot of wisdom. Afterwards, Viserys wanted to send Mr. Eamon to Pentos by boat, but the old man insisted on staying on the battlefield, and sticking to his Night's Watch oath. The coalition is actively preparing to deal with the next attack of the White Walkers. And north of the Neck, in the vast land that has been occupied by the army of the dead, there is white wind and snow everywhere. Everything is lonely and filled with death. A weak figure has heavy chains on his hands and feet. His head is a little disproportionate, and there are dark red blood scabs on his protruding forehead. He has an ugly face, one green and one black eye, a head of golden hair and a messy beard. He is Tyrion Lannister who escaped death in the cellar of Kaelin Bay. The explosion of the wildfire affected a wide range, but Tyrion survived by hiding underground. The shockwave of the explosion destroyed the wall of the cellar, allowing him to regain his freedom, but the chains on his hands and feet were still not broken. Tyrion was buried under the ruins for an unknown period of time. The Night King was safe and sound in the explosion of the wildfire, and then continued to move southward. The army of the dead followed him, which saved Tyrion's life again. After waking up, Tyrion crawled out of the ruins with his bare hands after hardships. His hands were stained with blood, and then he began to wander aimlessly in the north, which had become a dead domain, dragging heavy chains. He was looking forward to meeting anyone who could communicate, but unfortunately he did not meet them. But Tyrion was also very lucky not to encounter the scattered whites. During this time, Tyrion relied on eating bark, grass, and frozen corpses. As long as there was anything he could eat, he was willing to work hard to survive. However, on this day, Tyrion, who had reached the dual limits of physical and mental confusion, accidentally fell into a trap. But the first thing he thought of after falling was not fear, but ecstasy, complete ecstasy, and then fainted. Based on the family emblem on him, he may be Tyrion Lannister, the second son of Tywin Lannister, the Warden of the West. Benjen weighed the golden lion emblem taken from Tyrion in his hand, and then spoke. "Is he the imp?" When Ser Alizathorn saw the ugly dwarf on the ground, he spat. He thought it was prey, but it turned out to be the imp. "Fortunately, you reacted quickly, otherwise I almost thought he was a white, and chopped him with a knife. Should we take him away?" On the other side, Wandering Crow Yoren hesitated and asked. It was not a simple matter to involve a great noble. If you are not careful, you will get into trouble. "Of course. My brother. Where do you want to go? Please take me with you. You also know that a Lannister must pay his debts, and I'm a Lannister. My father is a Duke of Casterly Rock. Do you like gold, beautiful women, castles? As long as you rescue me, I will have all these things." At this time, Tyrion, who had quietly woken up on the ground at some point, had been eavesdropping on their conversation for a long time. Until he was sure that they were not in any danger, he suddenly opened his eyes and spoke. And a person who had fainted suddenly spoke, and he spoke a lot of things, as if he had not spoken for a long time, which scared everyone present. Benjen hesitated for a moment, and then spoke. We are also lives that have been saved by others, and we are also entrusted by others to go find Viserys. There is someone who wants to see him. Chapter 408, The First Battle of the Allied Forces. Year 293 of the Egan calendar. Since the White Walkers retreated on New Year's Day in 293, a Dothraki cavalry took the lead in the new year to fight against the White Walkers, who gradually walked out of the neck. Howl. The Dothraki on horseback let out a howl that was even more piercing than the Whites, and then spilled the barrels of kerosene tied to the horses' backs on the ground, threw torches on the ground to ignite the kerosene, and successfully separated and cut the formation of the army of the dead. Bang, bang, bang. Then a sharp arrow pierced through the sea of fire and fell into the army of the dead, and countless Whites fell down like wheat being cut. The army of the dead was different from humans, and Viserys told Cargo that he could not use tactics against humans. Humans would be afraid and terrified, and often the less elite troops would be defeated by a charge of the Dothraki, and their morale would be scattered, and then they would be harvested wantonly by the Dothraki. But the Whites can't do that. The Whites don't know fatigue or fear. It's undoubtedly a suicidal act to confront the Whites head on. Even if the cavalry relies on the hard armor, they will be defeated if they rush in. Therefore, the Dothraki used a more flexible and changeable way to deal with the Whites. That is the hunting tactics they use when hunting, constantly driving away and running away with the army of Whites. Anyway, the Whites only have 2 legs and can't run as fast as war horses, and they can't use bows and arrows. Then they set traps with kerosene to lure these brainless Whites into the trap and burn them to ashes with a fire, just like the Dothraki would drive them into traps when hunting grassland beasts. How a raging fire burned in an instant. The Dothraki rode on the horse's back, holding the reins with one hand, holding the scimitar in his hand high in the bright sunshine. Sharp howls like wolves came out from their mouths one after another, watching the Whites fall into the sea of fire, and the grey-brown fur on their bodies fluttered slightly in the cold wind. Then, after an unknown amount of time, the flames burned out, the ground was charred, and only the last bit of fire remained. Then, facing the last few Whites left, after being surrounded and annihilated by them, the Dothraki gave up their bows and arrows, and chose to go all out. They decided to defeat them with a charge. Oharat, Kago, wearing fur armor, loudly gave the order to charge in Dothraki, to crush the group of Whites, and the Dothraki were full of momentum. Rumble, followed by the rumble of horse hooves, dust and snowflakes flew. Clang clang clang. Countless scimitars were unsheathed and raised high, reflecting the cold light in the sun, and then fell lightly, directly chopping off the heads of the Whites, and crushed their bodies with horses' hooves, harvested heads with scimitars. Horses' hooves were in chaos, and the remaining hundreds of Whites were all crushed into powder by the chaotic iron hooves. Among the Whites, the leader was a white-haired White Walker. He was tall, wearing ice blue armor, wielding an ice sword, and killed several Dothraki cavalrymen in a row. He had a rusty dire wolf emblem on his chest. Looking at the humans rushing towards him again, his azure blue eyes were terrifying, and his mouth let out a piercing roar like the cracking ice. Ugh. Then he was killed by Cargo's skillful move of hiding a knife in his stirrups on horseback. His legs were tightly clamped around the horse's belly and his body suddenly stretched out. From a distance, he almost fell to the ground, but his legs were still tightly clamped around the horse's belly to prevent him from falling. Ogot. Cargo used this technique to dodge the sword of the White Walker and shouted in Dothraki, "Go to hell." Then he slashed the White Walker's neck with his backhand. Bang! The Valyrian steel scimitar slashed directly into the White Walker's neck. The opponent didn't even scream, and his body exploded instantly, scattering into broken ice all over the sky. Clang. The dire wolf emblem on his chest also fell to the ground. Seeing Cargo kill the White Walker with his ancestral dragon steel scimitar, cheers suddenly rang out among the Dothraki who were watching, cheering up the atmosphere. They worshipped the strong. Although Cargo was the blood god designated by the Khal, Cargo was able to command these tribesmen not because of Viserys' arrangement, but because his strength was recognized by the tribesmen. Kill the most ruthless people, and ride the most fierce horses. Khal rode the most powerful war horse in the tribe. Viserys rode a dragon, so naturally no one could defeat him, and Cargo's horse was second only to Viserys in the tribe. Of course, this was without counting Khaleesi. because in that war, Rhaenys rode Regal to burn the Dothraki, which directly incinerated them. Therefore, the Dothraki who later surrendered to Viserys had already recognized Rhaenys as their Khaleesi. After killing the White Walkers, Cargo sat upright on his warhorse, his chest rising and falling and breathing heavily. But he held the scimitar in one hand, then spread his hands, and opened his strong chest without defense. Cargo showed his bravery to the tribesmen around him, and listened to their cheers and worship. At the same time, Cargo roared loudly in the obscure Dothraki language, which was exchanged for even louder cheers. Roar, roar, roar. All the Dothraki raised their scimitars in unison, and made a deafening howl. It was like a group of demons dancing wildly. However, this is the most realistic living environment of the Dothraki, a grassland people who do not produce and specialize in plunder. The main theme of their life is nothing but killing and fighting. The Dothraki people are holding a carnival after the victory, but they see Eddard Stark and Stannis not far away. They both turned their heads and looked at each other. These barbarians are terrible. I have no doubt that killing us is just a simple after-dinner exercise for these barbarians. Eddard frowned and his tone was a little heavy. Stannis' face was also gloomy, but he didn't say a word. He actually figured it out. If Targaryen wants to attack Westeros, the first stop must be Dragonstone. It's a loss sooner or later, and thinking about it this way seems to make him feel much better. And Cargo is their leader. This is a basis of cooperation between the two sides and also politics. Cargo accepts this appointment on behalf of Viserys. The two need to lead the cavalry of the 7 countries to fight together with the Dothraki. Today, they discovered the traces of a small army of the dead, so they came with their guards to learn and observe. They did not expect to see such a horrifying scene. The Dothraki wiped out this small army of the dead with minimal losses. The riding skills of each of them are among the best in the coalition cavalry. At this time, Cargo rode a warhorse and came towards them with an interpreter. He said a few words in Dothraki, which were then translated into the common language. Ed nodded slightly in response. It was probably asking them if they understood the tactics of the Dothraki. Here, give it to you. After getting a positive answer, Cargo also nodded slightly. Then he took out the dire wolf emblem that the dead White Walker had just dropped from his arms and threw it to Edition. I think it is similar to the other things on your chest. It may be of some use to you. Pa. Ed reached out and caught the emblem thrown to him from mid-air. He was a little confused at first, but his face suddenly changed after he spread his palm. Chapter 409, Revelation from the King of Light. The Dothraki wiped out a legion of dead men and returned victorious, boosting the morale of the coalition. But when they returned, it was already night, and the sky was completely dark. In the Dothraki camp, the firelight was lit up, most of the soldiers had rested, and a few were on guard. A group of crows flew across the sky, fluttering, then they landed on the top of a huge tent in the camp, tilted their heads slightly, and then made a cry. These sounds gave life and vitality to the world. The north has become a dead zone. Because of the cold climate, even animals and birds have died and injured, and these sounds with life have naturally disappeared. And now the human soldiers are fighting here to prevent their hometown from becoming the GD of the north, and their wives and children from becoming whites. The tent where these crows landed was the residence of the Khal in the camp, a gorgeous golden tent. Most places in the camp had already fallen into darkness. Only here was still brightly lit, because Viserys had not yet lain down to rest. There was work to be done, and staying up late had long become the norm. At this time, 2 Dothraki guards holding torches lifted the tent and walked in with a woman in thin red clothes. Khal. This woman said, your friend. The guards in the camp spoke in Dothraki. Sitting in the big tent, Viserys, who was writing something at the table, raised his head slightly. He was stunned when he saw the red-dressed woman he had not seen for a long time, then nodded to the 2 Dothraki guards and spoke in fluent Dothraki. Yes, she is my friend. You go down. Hearing what the Khal said, the 2 Dothraki guards also lowered their heads slightly and said nothing more. Then they lifted the curtain of the tent and walked out. The person who came was Melisandre, who had disappeared for a long time. However, Viserys did not think that this mysterious woman had died on the battlefield, because her name has gradually spread among the 7 kingdoms, mainly among the lowest people in the 7 kingdoms. Melisandre followed millions of refugees from the north into the south. Millions of people were displaced and impoverished because of the attacks of the White Walkers. They were helpless. Their once firm beliefs collapsed because their gods did not play any role in the attacks of the White Walkers, let alone bring the light of hope. Melisandre took this opportunity to quietly promote the faith of R'hllor, the Lord of Light. The Red God's faith has not penetrated Westeros significantly for so many years. Most areas of the Seven Kingdoms firmly believe in the Seven Gods. The mainstream belief in the north is the Old God. The Iron Islands believe in the Drowned God, and Dorne believes in both the Seven Gods and natural creatures. However, now, R'hllor's faith finally has a chance to take advantage of, and began to appear on the land of Westeros on a large scale. Melisandre, riding a white horse and wearing a red dress, constantly spread the faith of the Red God to people in this desperate moment. She told people that in such a critical moment, only by following the true king and believing in R'hllor can everyone's lives be saved. Darkness and light, cold and heat, life and death. R'hllor is the mortal enemy of the cold god. The more believers who believe in R'hllor, the stronger the power of the gods against the cold god. Because of this, relying on the powerful power and mobility of millions of refugees in the north, Melisandre's name gradually began to spread throughout the Seven Kingdoms and flowed into the ears of some great nobles. Even Cersei, who is now the regent queen, has heard of Melisandre's name. Cersei wanted to recruit her into the Red Castle to see if there was anything she could use, and whether this red-robed witch was really as good at prophecy and omnipotent as rumored. Unfortunately, Melisandre did not agree to Cersei's recruitment. Instead, she disappeared without a trace in King's Landing that day, and even the Gold Cloaks could not find her in the city. It was obvious that King's Landing was no longer impregnable. Believers of R'hllor helped Melisandre escape from King's Landing. Then Melisandre appeared again in Viserys' tent. Viserys originally thought that Melisandre might use this power to be a high bishop or take the opportunity to challenge the supreme priest of the Red Temple in Volantis, Bonero, known as the Fire of Truth, Light of Wisdom, and first servant of the Lord of Light. However, he did not expect that the other party would come back after obtaining such a powerful power. Your Majesty, long time no see. Soon, only Viserys and Melisandre were left in the golden tent. The red-haired witch bent her knees slightly, and her red skirt fell to the ground. Then she slowly stood up and walked to Viserys' side. Melisandre still looked as charming as before, and her eyes fell on Viserys. Viserys' brows relaxed slightly, and then he put away what he was writing on the table. Indeed, it's been a long time. Melisandre. The light in the tent was dim, and the figure of the red-clothed woman swayed slightly with the flames in the brazier shining on the tent. Why are you back now? Have you found the answer you want? The red-robed witch stood beside Viserys, looking at the decorations in the golden roof tent. It was obvious that the place was full of Dothraki-style decorations, with horsehair, scimitars, bows and arrows everywhere, and an exaggeratedly large bed. For this nation, the Khal really needs a big bed. Yes, Your Majesty. That's why I came. Then Melisandre turned her head after hearing Viserys' words, and the casual expression on her pretty face disappeared a lot, and became serious instead. I got the revelation of the Lord of Light, and I must tell you. Prophecy? Viserys raised his eyebrows slightly when he heard Melisandre's words. What prophecy? He knew that Melisandre was proficient in prophecy. It was with the prophecy that she saw the process of roasting his dragon eggs, and then rushed here from afar. About the White Walkers, Melisandre said with a serious face. However, she couldn't explain it too clearly, and Viserys needed to perceive the revelation of God himself. Then the Red Witch helped Viserys stand up from the mat on the ground, and came to the blazing bonfire. Your Majesty, please look at this flame. Viserys frowned slightly, and then his eyes looked at the dancing flame. In an instant, in the light reflected by his pupils, he saw the red light in the sky above his head, and the darkness in the distance was like an eternal night gradually invading. Chapter 410 The God's Perspective. The next morning, the sky was a little more gloomy. The good weather was gone. With the footsteps of the White Walkers, the cold once again enveloped the twins. The Dothraki camp was busy again. The sound of horse hooves continued to ring out, and someone shouted something in the obscure horse language. Soon, the smoke gradually rose. Khal. More and more people came and went in and out of the Cal's tent, but few people knew what happened last night, including the arrival of the Red Witch and the silent conversation between the Lord of Light she believed in and Viserys. That being said, I still have some difficulty understanding what the Lord of Light wants to tell me. After a night's rest, in the morning, Viserys got up and simply handled some official business. He wore a loose shirt, and his long silver gold hair was not tied up, but was freely scattered. He glanced at Melisandre, who was still wearing a red robe. After returning from her trip to Westeros, she stayed in the army. The witch still wore the dazzling ruby necklace on her chest, and now she sat quietly on the futon in front of the table. The woman's long copper-colored hair was tied into a braid and hung on her chest. She looked more energetic than yesterday, and her deep red eyes seemed to be dancing with flames. Can you tell me what you saw in the revelation of the Lord of Light yesterday? Melisandre raised her delicate chin slightly with a calm expression, and then asked, maybe I can help you this way. Melisandre was also a little curious about what Viserys saw when he stared at the fire for so long yesterday. However, it was too late yesterday, and she didn't have time to ask clearly. Today, she had time, and she also had her own desire for knowledge. Viserys hesitated slightly, then nodded. Okay. Melisandre was a believer of the Lord of Light, ruler. There was nothing to hide from her about the Lord of Light, not to mention that he needed to make some explanations. Then he explained in detail what he saw when he looked at the pot of fire yesterday. In short, what he saw in the fire was like a slightly abstract dream. He saw a red light rising all over the sky, and in the distance was a bottomless darkness. Everything around was shrouded in these two lights, intertwined and inseparable, and there were many insignificant details under all this that caught Viserys' attention, and told them all to Melisandre. After Viserys finished explaining everything in detail, Melisandre fell into deep thought. The room became silent, with only the crackling sound of the bonfire burning. Is that so? The ruby on Melisandre's chest reflected the firelight. She was silent for a while, and then spoke again. The red light may represent the power of ruler, and the darkness represents the god of cold. Your Majesty, what you saw may be the battle between the Lord of Light and the other god. Melisandre made a simple analysis of Viserys' dream. She judged that the Lord of Light intended to let Viserys see the scene of the battle of gods with the help of his eyes. The power comparison between the two sides is now reflected on the battlefield of humans. Humans retreated to the twins, and the influence of the Lord of Light's power also retreated here. Viserys looked into the distance and saw that the deep darkness might be the north that is now completely swallowed by the cold. However, all this is completely different in the eyes of gods and mortals. In ruler's eyes, it is just a world full of monotonous colors. Melisandre, do you mean that I experienced ruler's perspective in the flames? Viserys couldn't help but frowned when he heard Melisandre's analysis, and then asked, in the eyes of the gods, the whole world is divided by several kinds of divine power. Then what are we? Damn chess pieces? Fighting a proxy war game on behalf of the gods? The whole world is the battlefield of the gods. The confrontation between the gods is not the earth-shaking horror scene imagined, but a battle like a breeze, moistening things silently. The battlefield is their chessboard, and the chess pieces are the people in the world. As chess players, the gods control the life and death of mortals, and the fate of mortals will indirectly affect the fate of the gods. If this is true, then the gods of this world do not seem to be as terrible as Viserys imagined. Melisandre's face was also slightly serious, but she shook her head and could not give Viserys an explanation. Don't talk about the gods, Your Majesty. What exactly are gods? How do they operate the whole world? Do they have human emotions? These are just superficial understandings that cannot be understood. Melisandre has spent her entire life trying to figure out what revelations God has brought her. That's why what happened last night happened. The Lord of Light brought her revelation, and she escaped from King's Landing and came to the front line to find Viserys. Then Melisandre continued to try to explain the dream that Viserys saw last night. The world that Viserys saw from ruler's perspective yesterday. Viserys looked back to the south, where the red light was strong and still had great power, and it looked like the sun was shining. Turning his head and looking towards the north, the deep black silver, there seemed to be a tendency to lose strength, but a lean camel was still bigger than a horse. This was the battlefield of the gods. Ruler, the Lord of Light, seemed to want to tell Viserys that the power of the alien gods was insufficient and the successors were weak. Perhaps this was also the reason why Viserys rode a dragon to the sky and had a brief fight with the Night King last time, and then the Night King ordered his troops to retreat. I once received a revelation from the Lord of Light. At this time, Melisandre suddenly spoke with a complicated expression. She glanced at Viserys and continued. The Lord of Light once asked me to come to Westeros to explore the truth of the resurrection of the White Walkers. Viserys nodded slightly after hearing what Melisandre said. At that time, Melisandre said goodbye to him and went to Westeros alone. It turned out that he had received a revelation from the Lord of Light. Then I came to Westeros, to the icy north, to the wall, and God told me once again that the other god should not be resurrected at this time. He came too early. He came too early? Melisandre's words were very calm, but they caused a stir in Viserys' ears. The silver-haired young man frowned and couldn't help but repeat it, because he knew that the others really shouldn't be resurrected at this time. The whole world was accelerating because of him. Chapter 411, Insufficient Divine Power. Yes, your majesty, the Lord of Light told me that the Azeroth god should not be revived at this time. Melisandre looked a little strange when she saw Viserys' big reaction, but she still repeated it. Perhaps the Azeroth god revived too early, and humans did not put up an effective resistance. The army of the dead advanced too fast. These are the reasons why the Azeroth god's power is running out of steam. The Night King had actually slowed down his pace, but in the end he was still advancing too fast, and his steps were too big, dragging himself down instead. He probably didn't expect that there were already dragons in this world, and they personally came out to stop him. The last time he went out was thousands of years ago, and it was hard to say whether dragons were born in this world at that time. Maybe they were still active near the 14 fire peaks of Valyria, or they were not creatures of this world, but at least they didn't appear in his sight at that time. However, although the power of the cold god was insufficient, the condition of the Lord of Light didn't seem to be much better. Viserys saw that the strong red light in the south, which seemed to be at its peak, seemed to be mixed with many black threads. Did the Lord of Light catch a cold? Viserys also asked Melisandre about this matter, and the Red Witch was silent for a long time, shook her head slightly, and could not give an answer. The conversation between her and the true Lord has always been Rilla talking and she listening. She told her story, but Rilla did not respond at all, and no one knew whether he heard it or not. Even the strange revelation given to her before, although she did it, she still has not figured out the reason. Why did he let her do this? What does the Lord of Light want from Viserys? The Red Witch had a second of doubt in her mind, and then hurriedly shook her head. But once the seeds of doubt are planted, it is difficult to eradicate them, and the woman's face is a little confused. Then Melisandre was silent for a long time, and then couldn't help asking again. If this is really the case, your majesty, don't we have hope of winning this time, and can we take this opportunity to kill the Night King? In any case, Melisandre knew that she was Rilla's servant. Her mission is to eradicate the White Walkers and help the true king save the whole world. Now that the Lord of Light has told them that the cold god's power is insufficient and his foundation is unstable, isn't this the best opportunity? Kill the cold god's servants in one fell swoop and completely put an end to the White Walker chaos that has plagued the world. It's hard to say. Viserys also took a deep breath and shook his head. Whether the Night King can be killed depends mainly on whether he gives me a chance. I'll try my best to find and kill him. Because of the unique black magic that has been lost in Valyria, Viserys himself is an extremely special existence. As far as he knows, there are two other such special existences. One is the Night King, and the other is the legendary Three-Eyed Raven. The main ability of the Three-Eyed Raven is not to fight, but to travel through the long river of time, know the secrets of the past, and can also see a little bit of the future. The Night King is a blaster. As long as he is alive, he can blast endlessly and drown all opponents with human seed tactics. Therefore, if he wants to hide, Viserys can't find him, and he has no way. The biting cold wind blew from the north. Snowflakes floated in the sky of the twins again. Not long after the Green Fork River froze for the first time in nearly 60 years, it was covered with frost again. After a year and a half of arduous battles with the White Walkers, all the soldiers of the coalition army had even gained experience. Just looking at the bad weather and the white snow in the distance rushing like thousands of troops, they knew that the White Walkers had come again. Fuck it. Sander Clegane sat on a tree stump outside the military camp in armor, with a huge sword at his side, looking into the distance, and cursing and spitting. He actually drank 2 teals of wine today, and wanted to come to the Dothraki camp to talk to Viserys. Because he was the only one who could kill his brother. Of course, this was not a love-hate relationship. Sander really hated his brother Gregor Clegane, the Mountain, and wanted to skin him alive, so he didn't want anyone to get ahead of him. He heard that his brother was imprisoned in the water dungeon of Pentus, and he was checked every day, just not to let him die, but to torture him for the rest of his life. However, Sander was full of anger when he drank, but when he arrived at the gate of the Dothraki camp, he saw the group of tall and strong grassland warriors, and the breeze made his bad temper much better. Just when Sander hesitated, the White Walkers arrived. Woo, woo, the alarm horn of the twins sounded, resounding throughout the sky, and the camp of the coalition army suddenly became busy. The White Walkers were still far away from the base camp, but the scouts had already discovered their traces in advance. A large number of coalition soldiers poured out of the camp, and began to line up on the banks of the Green Fork River. At the same time, the commanders riding on war horses were also shouting orders. Front. Hurry, hurry. The commander of the front line, Randall Tarley, was riding on a warhorse. He had only one ear left on his bald head, and the other was lost on the battlefield of the Wall. At this moment, he held the family heirloom Valyrian steel sword Heartbroken, and commanded the soldiers to line up on the riverbank. The allied soldiers wearing various family armors lined up on the riverbank, stretching the battle line, with flags flying and fluttering in the wind. And catapults and giant crossbows were pushed out, and sharp spears flashed with cold light, and pointed directly at the other side of the river, forming a super long-range firepower position. After Viserys arrived, the human coalition fully demonstrated its advantages. The advantages of the White Walkers were that they were fearless and tireless, while the advantages of humans were advanced productivity and wisdom. All mankind was united, and countless war weapons were mass-produced and continuously transported to the battlefield. The first batch of dragon crystals from Dragonstone was also transported here, but because of the tight time and scarce quantity, they were only used to make crossbow arrows for giant crossbows, hoping to snipe and kill the White Walkers. At this time, a dragon roar resounded throughout the sky, and a huge black dragon flapped its wings and flew across the sky, sweeping up the strong wind, blowing the soldiers on the ground twisted and crooked. A dragon rider sat on the dragon's back. The dragon did not stop at the bank of the Green Fork River, but flew alone towards the distant White Walkers with great skill and courage. This is a war between the living and the dead. Fight for our homes, for our wives, children, parents, and for all those who cannot fight. Robert, one of the supreme commanders, sat on his warhorse and gave an impassioned speech. Then, in the 293rd year of the Egan calendar, the Second Battle of the Twins, which left a deep mark in history, officially broke out. Everyone, get ready. Fire. Boom boom boom. One catapult after another roared, throwing stones burning with flaming flames to the other side of the Green Fork River. Bang, the spears fired from the giant crossbow easily tore through the formation of the army of the dead, stringing a row of whites together like a string of candied haws. Kill. The allied soldiers burst out with unprecedented strength and pushed the whites that had rushed across the Green Fork River back. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 412 Wildfire Ship. Ho! The giant dragon hovered in the sky, spewing flames from time to time, drowning a large number of whites in the sea of fire. Rumble. The ice surface frozen by the Night King melted again under the surging dragon flames. Many whites that rushed up slipped and fell into the water and were washed away by the rushing river, or were shot through the neck by the flaming arrows and then fell to the ground. Bang! Another sharp arrow with great force directly penetrated the head of a white. The arrow tip drilled into the eye socket and came out from the back of the head. The kerosene on the arrow was burning the body of the white. The white wearing the armor of the River Reach soldier let out a sharp howl and fell on the ice. Then he tried to struggle to get up, but was crushed by the whites that rushed up behind him. As the commander of the front line, Randall Tully slowly put down the bow and arrow in his hand, his face a little solemn. As a commander who had fought with the White Walkers many times, he was keenly aware that the White Walkers this time were well prepared, perhaps having learned the lesson of retreating last time. After all, the human side also had a strong ally. Randall Tully raised his head slightly and looked at the sky. The figure of the black dragon was still moving through the wind and snow, and the flames it spewed directly burned the whites that rushed to the river surface into ashes, and also melted the ice. Randall Tully was a tough guy who was both rigid and shrewd, and had a steel-like will. He was also famous for his straightforward words. His rigidity was reflected in his persistence on certain issues. For example, his affirmation of the oath and his loyalty to the feudal lord and the king. For example, he believed that women should stay in the delivery room instead of brandishing swords and guns, while men should be brave and fearless, fighting to the death on the battlefield. Because of this, he was very dissatisfied with his eldest son, Samuel Tully, because Samuel was fat and timid, and extremely lacked self-confidence, but he turned a blind eye to Samuel's advantages, such as he was very smart, loved reading, was good at thinking, etc. Randall Tully's shrewdness was reflected on the battlefield. He was the most famous general in the River Reach, and he was flexible and cunning in his use of troops. He once defeated Robert Baratheon head-on in the Battle of Poplar Beach, which was the only defeat Robert had suffered in his life before. He actually didn't like Viserys, even though he had fought for the Targaryen family to the end, because in his opinion, he had done his best to be loyal to the Targaryen family, and now he had surrendered to the Baratheon family with his own lord. Viserys' comeback with his troops became an invader in his eyes, and Viserys' vanguard was composed of some foreigners and rebels. But even so, he had to admit that Viserys' arrival greatly relieved the pressure on the coalition. Roar, the dragon's silhouette kept circling, gradually disappearing in the vast snowstorm, and only the dragon's roar could be heard. The snowstorm was getting stronger and stronger. In the final analysis, we still have to rely on ourselves. The bald man murmured softly, then pulled out the broken heart from his waist, and then chopped down a white with a sword, roaring angrily. Hold your position. In the center of the coalition, King Robert Baratheon rode on a majestic black-haired warhorse, holding a warhammer, quietly watching the battlefield in the distance. But it was much quieter here, not as lively as the front line. Although the center was not too far from the front, it mainly left some space for the soldiers in the front to retreat. If they were defeated and fled, they could escape from both sides of the center without impacting the formation of the center. The formation of marching and fighting is very important. The battlefield is not unlimited. It is useless to pile all the soldiers on the riverbank, and it will cause a chain reaction. Edward, the beard on his chin, fluttered slightly in the wind, and at this moment, Robert, who was staring at the battlefield in the distance, suddenly spoke. However, there was no response. Edward? Then Robert Baratheon turned his head to look at his side, and then turned his head to look at the other side. The soldiers and nobles around him all showed strange looks and whispered. Rose Bolton, the Earl of the Dreadfort, was assigned to the middle formation. He narrowed his eyes slightly and glanced at his king, wondering what he was thinking. The captain of the King's Guard, Barristan Selmy, Meryn Trent, Mandon Moore and others who followed Robert looked at each other in confusion. They all knew that His Majesty the King was nervous. Shit. It was only then that Robert remembered that Eddard was no longer by his side, but had led the cavalry of the Seven Kingdoms to the front line. Robert cursed in a low voice and clenched the warhammer in his hand. He suddenly felt a chill. It turned out that he had sweated a lot on his palms. According to the tactics of river defense, cavalry played a small role, and cavalry could not jump into the water to fight. Therefore, the Dothraki blood ridder Cargill led all the cavalry to cross the Green Fork River to the other side of the river, and he didn't know what he wanted to do. Get ready. Fire. Then, with the order of the commander of the siege weapon position, the crossbows and catapults roared again. Boom boom boom. A huge rock burning with flames passed over the heads of the soldiers in the front line, dragging black smoke behind them, and then fell into the Green Fork River. With the surging dragon flames, the fire almost illuminated the entire sky. Even the night was as bright as day. At this time, one of the coalition's trump cards, ships filled with wildfire, were also sent out. These ships were temporarily requisitioned civilian ships or merchant ships on the banks of the Green Fork River. Because they had considered in advance that the war might fail, the human coalition replicated the preparations before the Battle of Winterfell. The residents around had been evacuated long ago, and they were allowed to flee to the Westerly Territory or the Vale, or even further away. And these ownerless ships were naturally requisitioned. The ones operating these ships carrying wildfire were Euron Greyjoy and his Ironborns. This was an extremely dangerous task. If one was not careful, the ship and the people would perish together. However, Euron took it up without hesitation. Because in his opinion, this was an opportunity to seek wealth and honor in danger. Euron's genes were born with madness that was different from ordinary people. However, Euron was crazy, but he was not a fool. He would definitely not do anything to die. Now, Euron had one foot on the bow, a black eye patch on his cheek, and one eye looking at the battlefield in the distance. He was carefully directing the wooden boat carrying wildfire to approach the battlefield ahead. Chapter 413, full of magic power. Everyone, be careful. Then Euron stepped on the bow of the boat, turned his head, and shouted in a low voice. Now all the ships carrying wildfire are in the upper reaches of the Green Fork River. There is no fire here, and it is completely hidden in the darkness. And the Iron Races under his command are all top-notch fighters, living on the water all their lives. Now that the water is flowing downward, they can jump off the boat and leave, as long as they make sure that the boat will not deviate from the shore. Now, go. Then, seeing the right time, Euron gave an order. Plop, plop, all the Iron Races jumped into the cold water of the Green Fork River and swam hard to the shore, fearing that they would be affected if they were a step slower. The ships carrying wildfire drifted along the water and headed straight for the battlefield on the Green Fork River in the distance. Then, one by one, huge rocks burning with flames fell from the sky with long tails. Boom. One of the huge rocks hit the ship carrying wildfire. In an instant, a huge explosion swept the entire Green Fork River, and the battlefield was silent. Rumble. The sky was illuminated by the blooming green light, the water rose tens of meters high, and the airwaves carrying water vapor rolled and spread. On the other side of the Green Fork River, the coalition soldiers who were fighting in the front dropped their weapons and knelt on the ground, closing their eyes in pain and covering their ears tightly. Including Randall Tully, their eyes were stimulated by the strong light of the explosion, and tears flowed unconsciously. The huge explosion also made their brains lose consciousness for a short time and became blank. They even felt that the whole world became silent. Damn it. Randall Tully cursed, but he couldn't hear his own voice. Then a few seconds later, there was a crazy buzzing sound in his brain, and hot blood flowed out of his ears. All the whites who had just rushed across the Green Fork River were instantly blown to pieces in this huge explosion. There were also whites who were splashed by the escaping flames, and they let out sharp howls and turned into evil ghosts in the fire, and then fell down. Is this the power of wildfire? So spectacular. And in the sky, Viserys' ears were filled with strong winds. He lowered his head slightly and looked down. At that moment, the huge shock wave generated by the explosion even rushed into the sky and affected Balerion. However, these did not have much impact on Balerion and him, because dragons were born from flames, and he had blood that was not afraid of flames. But when Viserys saw this scene, his heart still tightened slightly. He and Balerion could not be afraid of the power of wildfire explosions, but ordinary soldiers could not. The Iron Throne is not useless as the orthodoxy of the Seven Kingdoms today, because the Pyramid Guild produced a large amount of wildfire for Robert in this war, even more than the amount of wildfire produced during the time of Viserys' father. And these wildfires may become obstacles for the Targaryen family to defeat the Iron Throne in the future. Viserys grabbed the saddle ring with one hand, and his heart was slightly absent-minded for a second, but then he returned to the topic. He was looking for the traces of the Night King among the army of the dead. But the view on the dragon's back is not very good. The dragon flies very fast, and the current wind and snow seriously affect Viserys' vision. However, the other party seems to have noticed that Viserys is constantly circling in the sky and is looking for him, and he has never shown up. Viserys knows that, if he wants to completely defeat the army of the dead, he must kill the Night King. All the White Walkers and Whites are caused by him, so the key to winning or losing this war lies in whether he can find and kill him. The Night King used to act carelessly because he felt that no human could threaten him, but now there is a dragon flying over his head, and the Night King has become low-key. Because of the wildfire blocking, the soldiers in the front got a little respite, and Viserys could also free up his hands to concentrate on searching for the traces of the Night King on the battlefield. "Where are you hiding?" The wind and snow whistled in his ears, and Viserys took a deep breath and muttered to himself. He held the saddle ring tightly with one hand and pressed it down slightly. The dragon began to lower its altitude. The silver-haired dragon rider's pair of violet eyes tried to penetrate the wind and snow, looking for the trace of the Night King below. The explosion on the river had a wide range. The icy road paved by the Night King on the river was completely blown to pieces, and countless whites were instantly destroyed. In the distance, on the other side of the Green Fork River. Now the geographical location of the second Battle of the Twins is a little earlier than the first one, located about 25 miles in front of the Twins, about 40 kilometers, at the fork of the Green Fork River. Now the coalition forces and the White Walkers are fighting on the other side. The coalition cavalry has quietly crossed the Green Fork River from two directions and came to the other side of the river, like a quiet hunter, ready to seize the opportunity to bite off the enemy's neck. The Dothraki are accustomed to such things as surprise attacks. The Knights of the Seven Kingdoms who are advancing with the Dothraki do not seem to be very accustomed to this tactic of wandering away from the main battlefield. However, their leaders, Lord Eddard Stark and Lord Stannis, were both serious and silent, and the remaining nobles and knights did not dare to complain. Then they heard a big explosion in the distance, and all the cavalry horses waiting for the raid were frightened and became a little manic. And Kago's eyes looked at the green light rising into the sky in the distance and showed a look of doubt. He did not expect that these tin cans would have such a terrifying weapon. But then Kago came to his senses and no longer hesitated. He seized this opportunity and directly ordered a raid. The Red Witch Melisandre also followed the Dothraki cavalry to the back of the White Walkers. She told Kago through the translator to let all the cavalry raise their weapons high, and then she grabbed Kago's Valyrian steel knife and whispered a spell. Since that night, Melisandre has noticed that the magic surging in her body has been greatly strengthened, and the magic is extremely full. She did not expect that there would be such a benefit. The ruby on her chest has become more vivid, helping her dispel the cold around her. Even the brave Dothraki was shivering with cold, but she only needed a single piece of clothing to cover her body, and was not afraid of the cold. The night was lonely and the surroundings were immersed in darkness. Melisandre held the blade in her hand, but her skin was not cut. She silently chanted spells, and her long copper-colored hair behind her gradually began to move without wind, and her robes also fluttered gently. The Dothraki Kago was still a little disdainful, because they hated witches the most. If it wasn't for the Khal asking her to follow, he would never pay attention to them. But now, Kago's face changed slightly, because his Valyrian scimitar actually burned with flames under Melisandre's palm, illuminating his cheeks. Then the next second countless unbelievable exclamations rang out. "Oh my god. 7 gods. Great horse god stars in the sky whoosh." Countless knights raised their weapons high, and their weapons all burned with red flames. The sky behind the army of zombies was illuminated by the tens of thousands of torches that suddenly appeared. Chapter 414. Have you ever seen a palm technique that falls from the sky? As the caster who created this miracle, Melisandre took a deep breath and almost fell off the horse. The ruby on the woman's chest dimmed instantly, but her eyes were still bright and bright, without any dimness, because at this moment her heart knot was untied not long ago. "So this is your intention?" It was not until then that Melisandre finally understood the purpose of the strange revelation made by the Lord of Light. She raised her head and looked at the sky illuminated by the fire. The cold wind lifted her red hair, and she couldn't help but murmur slightly. Tap tap. Then countless knights with lit flames around her heard Kago's order, passed by Melisandre with their weapons raised high, and went to the distance to stab the White Walker's ass. And on the front line, the explosion of wildfire swept across the river, and the green flames continued to burn on the river, blocking the attack of the army of the dead. The Night King's skeleton horse was melted by Viserys' dragon flame in the first battle of the twins. Now he stood on the ground with his feet hidden in the army of the dead. He had just put out the wildfire burning on the surface of the Green Fork River and paved a road of ice in the rushing river again. However, at this moment, whoosh, tens of thousands of torches suddenly lit up behind the army of the dead, illuminating the entire sky as bright as day, including the Night King. Countless whites and ancestors of the Stark family could not help but turn their heads. The Night King, with the frozen crown on his head and an ancient stone sword on his back, turned his head to look at the fire behind him. The ice blue flames burning in his eyes were beating violently. It seemed that his heart was not as calm as it seemed on the surface. However, at the same time, whoosh, the wind was howling above his head, and a huge shadow penetrated the wind and snow, suddenly swooped down from the sky, and a loud dragon roar came out of his mouth. Finally, Viserys tightly grasped the saddle ring on the dragon's back, his eyes fixed on the Night King who was hiding in the countless dead army on the ground. "I found you." The next second, rumble, the overwhelming dragon flames gushed down, and the violent flames washed the ground frantically. Countless whites turned into ashes under Balerian's dragon flames. Ever since the wildfire exploded, Viserys has been trying to find the trace of the Night King. Wildfires can burn on the water, so if the Night King does not personally extinguish these flames, the army of the dead will not be able to continue to cross the Green Fork River to attack the coalition's front line at night. Viserys was just waiting for the Night King who was hiding in the vast sea of corpses to expose himself. However, as expected, the Night King finally couldn't help but take action. He extinguished the flames of the wildfire, but at the same time exposed his position. Balerion was extremely sensitive to the existence of magic, especially when the opponent's magic was mainly ice attributed, like a bright light in the dark, which was eye-catching. As soon as the Night King made a move, he attracted Viserys' attention. Then the dragon penetrated the snow and landed directly on the opponent's face. In the distance, the White Walkers scattered in the army of the dead and the famous kings of the north in history all turned their heads to look at this side. They sensed that the Night King was in trouble and was being directly attacked by the dragon. But they didn't dare to approach directly because the Night King was immune to the burning of dragon flames, but they were not. This opponent was not prepared for them. On the ground, rumbled the huge pillar of fire that fell from the sky hit the earth crazily, and the dragon kept flapping its wings and stopped in the air, making a deafening roar. With the Night King as the center, all the nearby dead ghosts had turned into ashes under the dragon flames, clearing a blank piece of land in the vast army of the dead. The Night King, wearing the ice crown, was still kneeling on one knee in the center of the open space, holding the ancient stone sword high in his hand to resist the impact of the dragon flame. After an unknown amount of time, the dragon flame finally stopped. The dragon could not spit out dragon flame endlessly. The huge black dragon roared unwillingly, then spread its wings and flew away. Seeing the black dragon leave, the Night King finally slowly put down the stone sword in his hand, and then stood up. He looked at the back of the black dragon going away. His eyes burning with blue flames were indifferent, and seemed to have a little sarcasm. The same trick was used twice by humans, but the dragon flame was not enough to kill him. However, at this moment, before the Night King could stand up completely, the sky wrapped in wind and snow was illuminated by the fire, and a figure suddenly fell from the sky. Whoosh, his figure penetrated the white wind and snow, and the wind whistled in his ears, and he was falling rapidly. The man was wearing a full body of bright silver Valyrian steel armor, a white tasseled helmet on his head, and a pair of violet eyes were piercing in the dragon flames that had not been completely extinguished. Viserys fell from the sky, holding the Star Sword Dusk, and stabbed the Night King with one sword. And below, the Night King standing on the ground seemed to have noticed someone above his head, and suddenly raised his head. Then he saw that under the light of the fire, the dragon rider actually fell from the sky. The flames in the Night King's eyes jumped, and suddenly became violent. He let out a roar like the ice cracking, and then the stone sword in his hand once again blocked in front of him. He wanted to stop Viserys' attack. However, Viserys' figure falling from the sky turned into a ball of black smoke in midair, and disappeared in an instant. The Night King's eyes suddenly condensed, and the flames in his eye sockets became more intense. And in the next second, swish, a scarlet longsword pierced the back of the Night King from behind. But the Night King also reacted quickly. He turned his head suddenly and looked directly at Viserys with a pair of cold eyes. This was the first time the two had fought face to face. Ding. Then, the stone sword in the Night King's hand and the dusk in Viserys' hand collided violently, and sparks burst out. What a powerful force. In the violent snowstorm, Viserys jumped off the dragon from the sky and started a one-on-one duel with the Night King. The surrounding whites had been cleansed by the dragon flame, and no one would disturb them. After Viserys changed his body shape, he wanted to assassinate the Night King from behind, but the other party reacted. The swords collided with each other, and Viserys immediately felt a chill and power that penetrated into his bones, and his face changed slightly. However, Viserys reacted quickly, and didn't care about shocking the Night King's terrifying strength. His other hand had already drawn the Valyrian steel dagger at some point. He held the hilt, and stabbed it straight into the Night King's abdomen. Die. Chapter 415. Duel with the Night King. Die. Swish. Viserys moved quickly, gritted his teeth slightly, and stabbed the Valyrian steel dagger in his other hand straight into the Night King's abdomen. He knew that the opponent's body seemed hard but extremely fragile. As long as he was stabbed with dragon crystal or Valyrian steel, he would be torn into pieces in an instant. Unfortunately, the dagger in Viserys' hand was only an inch away from the Night King's abdomen, and it was just a little bit away from stabbing the opponent's body. But the Night King reacted and grabbed his wrist directly. Snap. The Night King held Viserys' wrist tightly, his eyes flashing with a terrifying light, and seemed to be a little shocked and angry. He just really almost got killed by a human. And Viserys also stared at the number one enemy in human history at such a close distance. His eyes were solemn. Night King. The opponent has been destined to destroy the entire world since 8,000 years ago, and is the biggest villain and boss in the world. The Night King's eyes are deep, as if a bottomless pit swallows everything around him. Viserys and the Night King looked at each other closely. Then the silver-haired young man felt an unprecedented horror for the first time, and felt the hair on the back of his neck explode. This guy. Viserys felt terrified, his eyes slightly condensed, and the place where his wrist was held by the Night King also felt a bone-chilling cold. His whole arm even became stiff and numb. If he was held by the Night King for a few more seconds, perhaps Viserys would be frozen into an ice lump. Then Viserys stabbed the Night King with his right hand, forcing him to let go of him, and the Night King dodged, and the stone sword in his hand also slashed directly at Viserys. Ding. The weapons of the two collided again, and the charred ground and the snowflakes that had just fallen were shaken and flew up. The stone sword exuded an unprecedented shocking chill, and the magic weapon in Viserys' hand, the dusk made of the heart of the meteorite, also exuded a scorching breath to dispel the cold around Viserys. Then the Night King took the initiative to attack again, gained the upper hand, and stabbed again, but Viserys dodged it slightly by turning sideways. Although he was wearing a full set of Valyrian steel armor, Viserys' movements were still agile, and the Night King also had a set of extremely ancient bronze armor that looked like it was from an unknown era, covered with a layer of frost. In the white wind and snow, clang clang the artifacts collided, and sparks flew. The two of them fought back and forth, and started a one-on-one fight. The land that had just been cleaned by the dragon's flame was now covered with a layer of snow, and it became covered with silver. However, it seemed that the Night King had deliberately ordered that the surrounding White Walkers and Whites did not disturb the two people fighting in the middle. Viserys wanted to kill the Night King himself to end this war and save the whole world. The Night King also had the same intention. He wanted to kill Viserys and eliminate the last obstacle that prevented him from destroying the world. Therefore, the two most important figures for both camps started a one-on-one duel here. Clang clang, then the long swords collided violently again, and Viserys' feet slipped slightly. The Night King raised his foot and kicked Viserys directly, and Viserys also blocked his chest with his arms. Bang! The Night King's kick was powerful and heavy, and Viserys was kicked out and instantly slid several meters backwards. His feet plowed to shallow gullies in the snow, and then he finally stopped. The Night King kicked Viserys away, and the Valyrian steel dagger in the silver-haired young man's other hand was thrown out at the same time as the Night King kicked out. The dagger pierced the opponent's throat from bottom to top, and the Night King tilted his head slightly, as if trying to dodge it. However, the Night King was unable to dodge, and the Valyrian steel dagger directly hit the ice crown on the Night King's head, easily cutting off a corner of the crown. Clang! In the dark wind and snow, a crisp sound was instantly heard. The dagger sank into the darkness, and a corner of the crown fell to the white ground. The Night King stood there, his expression clear, and was slightly stunned. Then he raised his hand and touched the ice crown on his head that had been cut off, and his face suddenly became gloomy. Viserys, who was kicked away and kneeling on one knee on the ground not far away, also took a deep breath. He raised his head and saw that the dagger only hit the Night King's ice crown, cutting off a corner of the crown, and a look of disappointment suddenly appeared on his face. Then he supported the ground with his 5 fingers, wrapped in bright steel, and stood up staggeringly. The Night King was also not far away, with his eyes burning with flames, looking at him with a sharp gaze. Viserys gritted his teeth slightly. Then the two of them did not say a word, and rushed towards each other again in silence in the white wind and snow. The Night King and Viserys started a one-on-one duel on the other side of the Green Fork River. The cavalry troops that had circled behind the army of the dead raised their weapons, that were led by Melisandre's powerful magic, and rushed towards the endless undead. Kill. Roar, roar, roar. The cavalry of the Seven Kingdoms coalition and the Dothraki mixed together to form an unstoppable and magnificent steel torrent. The earth was shaking under the galloping of tens of thousands of horses, stabbing directly into the buttocks of the army of the dead. Although the boundless army of the dead had suffered a heavy blow in the battle of crossing the river, it still had extremely terrifying numbers. The coalition forces repeatedly changed the statistics of the army of the dead, from tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands at the beginning to millions or even more. The few people killed by wildfires and the damage caused by catapults, giant crossbows, and soldiers fighting hard were just drizzle for the army of the dead. On the north bank of the vast Green Fork River, there were endless whites waiting to advance south, but they were forced to block here. Rumble, the largest all-cavalry unit in the history of Westeros, rushed over. If any nobles or soldiers of the Seven Kingdoms saw this scene, they would be so frightened that their formation would collapse, or even kneel down and surrender. However, the whites were not afraid at all, and turned their heads, and rushed towards the cavalry. Boom. Then the human cavalry and the whites who were charging in the front collided fiercely, and a huge noise broke out in an instant, followed by blood and flesh flying everywhere, and screams. Kill. Looking down from the sky, the endless black army of the dead was instantly cut open with a shocking huge wound, and the trauma caused to the White Walkers by just this moment of contact was greater than the impact of the wildfire exploding on the river. In the era of cold weapons, cavalry is still the unrivaled king. The cold wind was howling, and the flames shot up into the sky. The Dothraki shook the flaming scimitars in their hands, rushed into the white formation, and harvested the whites' heads wantonly. Chapter 416. Defeat at the front. The cavalry of the Seven Kingdoms and the Dothraki together charged the Legion of the Dead. On the front line of the Green Fork River, people could see nothing except the flames that suddenly shot up into the sky in the distance. Even the soldiers standing on the watchtower could only see the white snow. Under such circumstances, it was extremely difficult to unify the command and coordinate the battle. It completely depended on the commander's ability to respond on the spot. 7 layers of hell. What happened over there? Doesn't anyone know? Robert rode on his warhorse and carried his hammer. His black beard fluttered in the wind. He cursed and was restless. Suddenly, he felt uneasy, but Robert didn't know where this uneasy emotion came from. It came from all directions, up and down, left and right, and the only thing that could do this was the snowflakes flying all over the sky. Perhaps it was this ignorance of being wrapped in snow and limited vision that turned into panic and helplessness in his heart. The main force in the coalition center was also affected by the commander and became a little restless. People whispered, but didn't know what was happening. On the banks of the Green Fork, the front troops led by Randall Tarley, who were the first to fight against the whites, finally couldn't hold on, and some signs of defeat appeared. Help. Save me. Save me. The fire flickered in the darkness, and more defeated troops began to appear on both sides of the central troops. Crash. Crash. The sound of armor rubbing was heard everywhere in the darkness, and the footsteps were so dense that they were almost panicking. There were also screams, and the allied soldiers from various families threw away their armor and fled back from the front line in a panic. Run. Run quickly. The Central Army was silent like a stubborn stone, waiting in a strict battle formation, with sharp swords and spears ready to meet the enemy. Everyone, go from both sides. Those who charge the formation will die. Rose Bolton, the Earl of the Dreadfort, rode on a warhorse, holding a whip in his hand, and shouted at the defeated troops loudly. As more and more soldiers were defeated on the front line, the allied soldiers in the central formation gradually became nervous, holding their weapons tightly, and sweat oozed from their palms. They are coming. The howling of the whites in the ears of the allied soldiers became clearer and clearer. Although they could not see the front clearly, which was covered by the white snow, the sound was gradually approaching. This invisible fear was gradually getting worse. I don't know how many people swallowed their saliva. Giloo. The soldiers looked at each other and saw the fear in each other's eyes. The warhorse under Rose Bolton's crotch also became a little uneasy, constantly tidying up the horse's hooves. The cold wind was biting, and white mist came out of the thick nostrils of the warhorse. The cold and cunning Earl of the Dreadfort was blowing the icy cold wind and listening to the shouts of killing everywhere. He was sitting on the saddle and suddenly felt a little uneasy. He turned his head left and right involuntarily. Then his brows frowned slightly. He always felt that someone was staring at him, and it seemed that he had bad intentions. But now there were so many people on the chaotic battlefield, and he couldn't find that person. Is it an illusion? Rose Bolton slightly pulled the reins to make the warhorse under his crotch calmer. His eyes were calm and without ripples as he scanned the surroundings. In fact, no matter how horrible the battlefield was or how terrible the White Walkers were, he would not be in any great danger because the nobles in the coalition would always leave first once they found that the situation on the battlefield was not right. This was why the highest ranking noble who died in the war was the old Lord Walderfree of the twins, and he was so scared that he jumped into the river and died. There were very few records of high ranking nobles being killed in battle. There was one in the west, John Umber, and another one. Rose Bolton had forgotten what it was. Therefore, he had nothing to fear. If the whole Westeros was destroyed, he could just flee to the other side of the narrow sea. He also invested in a good son in Viserys, his illegitimate son Ramsay Snow. In the recent communications, he also learned that Ramsay was valued by Viserys and obtained a position to monitor the internal affairs, which seemed to be called the Ministry of Internal Affairs. Maybe it was to eliminate corruption, inspecting all officials. There is no specific independent position like this in the Seven Kingdoms. Intelligence matters, both internally and externally, seem to be managed by the Minister of Intelligence. The new dynasty has split this power to prevent the Minister of Intelligence from monopolizing power. Therefore, Rose Bolton did not know what kind of situation his illegitimate son Ramsay was in Viserys' side. But what is certain is that Rose Bolton never took Ramsay seriously. He was just his illegitimate son and a pawn for him to bet on both sides. The heir to the Dreadfort is a young talent far superior to Ramsay. Demeric Bolton is different from his father and brother. He is very quiet and versatile, proficient in history, good at harp and riding, as if he was born in a saddle. Rose Bolton is very satisfied with his son. And what Rose Bolton did not notice was that in the back, in the middle of the coalition army shrouded in the night, there were two soldiers wearing king's armor not far from his position. They were looking at the back of the Earl of the Dreadfort riding on horseback, and then whispered quietly, with a fierce light flashing in their eyes. At the front line, after the wildfire was extinguished by the Night King, the whites once again surged across the Green Fork River. The soldiers in the front line could not hold on and finally collapsed. Earl Thomas Smallwood of Oak Hall died on the spot. Selwyn Tarth, Earl of Duskfall Hall, who had proposed to defend the river at the pre-war meeting, was also torn into pieces by the whites. Reinald, the eldest son of Earl Gorwyn Westerling of the Rock, fell into the water and his life and death were unknown. It seemed that there was a bad omen. The nobles who had suffered few casualties in the previous war suddenly suffered a sharp increase in casualties in this war. This may also be related to the increasingly fierce war. And Randall Tully, the commander of the front line, was once again helped by his guards to mount a warhorse and fled to the rear. Randall Tully was covered in blood, his armor was tattered, he sat on the horse and panted, turned his head unwillingly and looked back, watching more and more whites rushing to the bank of the Green Fork. Again. This was not the first time he had escaped. He had been defeated repeatedly in the previous battles with the White Walkers. He had experienced this scene of being helped onto a warhorse by the guards and escaping several times. A victorious general was turned into a defeated general. But there was no way. The coalition army was defeated, and he alone was powerless to save the situation. Go. Then Randall Tully squeezed his legs and lay on the horse's belly, and the tattered armor on his body made a sound. He followed the defeated army and fled to the rear. Chapter 417. Unexpected changes. The soldiers in the front line were completely defeated, while the main force of the coalition in the middle line was ready for battle. Everyone, prepare to fight. Robert Baratheon, the king of the Seven Kingdoms, was wearing heavy black armor, with a crowned stag with angry hair on his chest and a black helmet on his head. The horse's hooves kicked up the dust and snow on the ground. He was riding a tall horse and inspecting the formation of the coalition army. The heavy sound of horse hooves stomped on the ground, and at the same time, he spoke in a loud voice like a bell. Raise your shields. The king was on the left and right in the middle line of the coalition army, and the morale of the soldiers was naturally more determined. Countless shields were raised high and blocked in front of them. The three king's guards following behind the king also rode on their war horses, wearing white armor without family emblems, and their snow-white cloaks fluttered in the wind. The king has a bit of his former shadow. Barristan Selmy, the captain of the king's guard, looked at Robert's back and said with satisfaction, while holding the reins with one hand, Robert used to be tall and mighty, with a generous personality. He was famous for his unrivaled bravery in the Seven Kingdoms. He was the dream lover of countless girls. However, after winning the crown, Robert's excessive indulgence in wine and sex destroyed his body and spirit. However, in Barristan's view, Robert has now recovered a bit of his former self under the stimulation of the White Walkers and the other two king's guards following the captain. Ser Mandan Moore sat on the horse in silence, and Ser Meryn Trent sneered silently, then glanced at Barristan's back and squinted his eyes slightly, wondering what he was thinking. The dark clouds of the decisive battle are shrouded. The dawn has not yet arrived, and the sky is only slightly white. However, the various thoughts of the coalition forces are never boring. On the contrary, the whites are united, without any distractions, fighting to destroy the world and eliminate all life. Hula. Countless defeated frontline soldiers fled from both sides of the center. The figure of the frontline commander Randall Tully also passed by here. He lay on the back of his horse, not knowing whether he was dead or alive, and just let the horse run freely without looking back, and fled into the darkness. When Robert saw the other party, he didn't know why his heart sank slightly. But now Robert could no longer hesitate. With the increasing number of defeated frontline soldiers, the sharp howling of the whites following these remnants of the defeated soldiers was getting closer and closer, and the heavy footsteps made the ground under the feet of the coalition soldiers tremble slightly. Rumble. Then Robert's eyes penetrated the wind and snow, and the dark army of dead people that could not be seen at a glance finally rushed up. Here they come. Robert clenched the warhammer in his hand, and countless coalition soldiers swallowed their saliva and clenched their shields or spears. The next second, boom, as if a heavy tank rushed in, a huge crash, and the sound of bones breaking came. Several allied soldiers were knocked high and flew out, screaming and falling to the back. A huge corpse mammoth broke into the coalition army in the face of the dead army. Half of its head had turned into a hole, as if it had been gnawed by something, revealing the rotten flesh and blood that emitted a foul smell. Only one eye was left, and the blue light was full of bloodthirstiness and madness. One of the long tusks of the corpse mammoth was broken into half, but it still tore through the seemingly unbreakable formation of the coalition like a rotten tree. On the back of the mammoth sat a white-haired White Walker wearing ice armor. His eyes were directly locked on Robert Baratheon in the center of the coalition, and a sharp sound of ice cracking came out of his mouth. Then, holding the ice sword, he urged the mammoth under his crotch to rush directly towards Robert. He recognized that Robert might be the king of this group of humans, and wanted to capture the king first. Countless whites followed him, and attacked the coalition's front line frantically. At this time, bang! A bowstring burst, and a spear on a giant crossbow suddenly shot out, making a sharp sound of breaking through the air. The obsidian spearhead pointed directly at the white-haired alien sitting on the back of the skeleton mammoth. Go to hell. The coalition soldier in charge of controlling the giant crossbow had a face full of the pleasure of revenge and outright hatred, which intertwined with each other and even became twisted, and his heart was completely filled with hatred. He was a soldier in the north. His hometown became a ghost den. His mother died in the north and may have become a white, and his wife was bitten by a poisonous snake on the neck causeway on the journey to the south. However, he was just an ordinary person, a small microcosm of this unfortunate era, and there were many people like him who suffered an unfair fate. An ordinary coalition soldier controlled a giant crossbow and fired a spear. The spearhead was made of dragon crystal and was full of hatred. It easily pierced the chest of the alien. These dragon crystals were the first batch of dragon crystals mined by the Targaryen family after they occupied Dragonstone and were transported to the front line to make weapons. The white-haired and white-bearded alien riding the mammoth white still had disbelief on his face. He didn't expect that he would be killed so easily by humans after living for so many years. Bang, then it burst into a sky of broken ice shards, fell to the ground, and completely disappeared from this world. Only his mound was left, raising its stinking trunk and heavy front feet high, and making a terrifying roar. Woo, the desolate horn sounded from behind. Before dawn, under the dim light. Kill. Kill. The soldiers of the coalition fought back. The whole battlefield was filled with shouts of killing, the howling of whites, and the sound of swords piercing flesh and blood. Hold your ground. Fight till death. Lord Rose Bolton of the Dreadfort was concentrating on commanding the battle, not paying any attention to his back. Puff puff, but at this moment he was dragged off his horse, and 2 daggers pierced his chest directly from behind, and blood gushed out instantly. 2 soldiers wearing royal armor seemed to be hugging, but took advantage of the chaos on the battlefield to pierce Rose Bolton's chest with daggers. At the same time, one hand covered his mouth to prevent him from shouting. Looking at the disbelief on the face of the Lord of the Dreadfort, the soldier sneered, and then whispered something in his ear. Rose Bolton's eyes widened slightly, and the gushing blood entered his airway, and spurted out of his mouth. He wanted to say something, but he couldn't say anything. He could only stare with his eyes wide open and swallow his last breath. Lord Ramsay asked me to say hello to you. Demeric will be down to accompany you soon. Woo. At this time, the horn sounded even louder from the rear, finally attracting the attention of the soldiers fighting on the front line. What's going on? What's wrong with the rear? Robert was covered in blood, holding the warhammer with a look of shock and anger on his face. Because this was a horn sound for the rear to retreat. Chapter 418, White Walker familiar with the art of war. The person in charge of the rear formation was King Robert's father-in-law, Duke Tywin Lannister, the Guardian of the West. The front and middle formations were the main forces against the White Walkers, and the rear formation also needed a mature and steady commander, so the coalition forces unanimously nominated Duke Tywin to sit in the rear. However, no one expected that it was in the rear where Duke Tywin was in charge that something went wrong at such a critical moment. The soldiers in the middle formation, led by the king himself, were fighting against the White Walkers, and suddenly the horn of retreat sounded in the rear. The darkness gradually faded, and a faint light appeared on the horizon. The coalition forces had fought fiercely all night and finally survived until dawn. They thought they could take the opportunity to breathe a sigh of relief, but they did not expect that the arrival of dawn would fall into deeper darkness. The coalition forces had already explored experience in this long battle. The attacks of the whites would become excited at night and fall into a slump during the day. The 2 assassins who assassinated Rose Bolton also took advantage of the chaos on the battlefield and disappeared on the spot. The battlefield was in chaos. The guards of the Earl of Dreadfort reacted belatedly, but they only found the body of Rose Bolton. The killer had already escaped without a trace. Woo. The retreat horn sounded from the rear and soon disappeared after it sounded. Kill. The fierce battle on the front line was still going on. There were clanging sounds everywhere, screams, and shouts of killing. Robert was covered in blood, and his armor of the crowned stag became a little tattered. He was panting and holding a hammer, and grabbed a passing nobleman. The opponent had the emblem of the winter sun on his chest. It seemed that he was a child of the Karstark family of Karha. What happened in the rear? Go and see. Robert grabbed Torhan Stark, the second son of Rickard Stark, the Earl of Kaha, and shouted loudly. His cheeks and beard were covered in blood, and he looked so hideous that Torhan was startled, but he immediately recognized that the man in front of him was the king of the Seven Kingdoms, so he hurriedly agreed with fear and trepidation. Understood, Your Majesty. Then Torhan Stark, who was also a little embarrassed, immediately jumped on his warhorse and galloped to the back to see what happened to Lord Tywin Lannister. And watching Torhan Stark's back, Robert also panted slightly. 7 layers of hell. Then he licked his chapped lips, turned his head, and looked at the whites that kept coming like the tide of the sea. The muscles on Robert's face twitched slightly, and he cursed fiercely. Fuck it. Then he clenched the hammer in his hand and rushed forward again. Although it was already dawn, the wind and snow showed no sign of stopping. The heavy snow in the sky continued to fall, and everything was white, so the vision and visibility were extremely poor. He didn't know what was happening behind him. The young second master of Kaho City, Torhan Stark, was also injured in the battle just now. He was slapped on the chest by a black bear that turned into a white. Fortunately, he was wearing hard armor, especially the thickened breastplate at such a critical position as the chest, which saved his life. However, there was a mouthful of blood in his chest that he had not spit out yet, and it was a bit uncomfortable to hold it in his throat. Trample, trample. The horse's hooves trampled through the snowflakes, and Torhan Stark, wearing tattered armor, lay on the horse's back and went to the back. At this time, he seemed to hear some special movement and immediately raised his head slightly from the horse's back and looked over. But he only saw an ice arrow piercing the wind and snow, and his pupils were rapidly enlarged. Help! Torhan Stark's eyes instantly showed fear, but before he could open his mouth to shout, puff, this ice arrow had already pierced his throat fiercely. The sharp arrowhead drilled out from the back of his neck, and blood slowly flowed down. Then the body sat on the horse's back and shook slightly, and then fell headfirst into the snow with a plop, completely without a sound. And Torhan's warhorse seemed to have seen something extremely terrifying. The warhorse neighed sadly and nudged its master lying motionless on the ground with its head. After receiving no response, it finally couldn't help but flee into the distance. And the person who shot Torhan didn't continue to embarrass a warhorse. Then, in the white wind and snow, rustling footsteps gradually sounded. Countless swaying figures walked out of the wind and snow, and then there was an army of whites that could not be seen at a glance. And the leader of this group of whites was a female white ghost with dark hair and blue eyes. She had pale skin and was very beautiful. She had a metal emblem on her chest. She rode a skeleton horse and held an ice bow in her hand. It seems that it was she who shot Torhan Stark with an arrow just now. Dawn is like a sharp sword, splitting the night. It's daybreak. The biting cold wind blew the hair of the White Walker, and the female White Walker riding on the skeleton horse tilted her head slightly, then retracted her gaze. Then the army continued to move forward in silence, and among these people were many figures wearing iron clothes, and even one of them had disheveled hair and only one arm left, and it seemed that he was wearing a driftwood crown on his head. The last news about the Iron Islands was that they were attacked by the White Walkers a few months ago, and then the Iron Islands completely lost contact with the Westeros continent. Ravens flew over one by one, and then they never returned. However, the coalition forces of the Seven Kingdoms were preparing for the Battle of Moat Cailin with all their strength at that time, wanting to rely on the neck to snipe the White Walkers, and even planning a plan to kill the Night King with wildfire. So they naturally had no time to take care of the Iron Islands. The Iron Islands have lost contact since then, and it is still shrouded in fog, and no sound after several months. Are there any living people on the Iron Islands? How is Balon Greyjoy, the king of the Iron Islands? No one knows now. However, the White Walkers who attacked the Iron Islands at the beginning now led a larger army of the dead and suddenly appeared on the sea. They attacked seaward directly from the Ironborn Bay. Endless whites emerged from the sea and headed for seaward. And Jason Mallister, the Earl of Seaward, had already gone to the coalition to help. The few remaining soldiers naturally could not resist the offensive of the White Walkers. Therefore, Seaward fell easily, and there was not even one person who escaped alive to report the news. In addition, because of the war with the White Walkers, the people near the battlefield in the Riverlands had long been dismissed. The front line did not receive the news of the fall of Seaward at all, and was not prepared for it. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 419. Robert is shot by an arrow. However, this huge army of the dead did not stop at all after conquering the seaside city. Instead, they continued to rush to the battlefield in front of them and directly stabbed the unprepared coalition headquarters, the twins, in the back. The defenders of the twins did not expect that a legion of the dead would appear behind them, as if they had fallen from the sky. While Balerian's dragon flames were burning the whites on the Green Fork River and the coalition soldiers were fighting hard on the front line, the twin towers of the Free family quietly fell in the back. The twins officially fell. One of the weapons that humans rely on most to fight against the White Walkers is human wisdom. The whites are just monsters without brains, and they can only fight continuously based on instinct. However, perhaps because humans and the White Walkers have been on the line for too long, they have also been pulled into the realm of having no brains. They even made a fatal mistake. They had no idea that the White Walkers would cut off their retreat because the rear of the main formation was completely defenseless. In the previous wars, the Night King waved his hand and the White Walkers directly flattened the human defense line. The White Walkers suddenly reading the art of war was the main reason why the coalition was caught off guard. Fortunately, the twins, as the base camp of the coalition, had survivors who escaped when it fell and rushed to the battlefield to report the news. Because of the position of the formation, the news was naturally intercepted by Tywin Lannister, the commander-in-chief of the coalition. But I don't know why Tywin was delayed for several hours in the process of passing the news to Robert Baratheon, the commander of the entire army in the middle formation. The Duke of Casterly Rock looked extremely ugly after receiving the news. Then he immediately sent a messenger to report to his son-in-law in front of everyone, and began to dispatch troops to set up a defense line to defend against the enemy from the rear. However, the messenger sent by Tywin seemed to be lost in the snow and never returned. Then Tywin sent messengers to the main camp again and again for help. He thought Robert should have received the message he sent and made proper arrangements, but in fact, the commander of the entire army in the middle camp had no idea that but was stabbed by the White Walkers. So when the army commanded by Tywin in the rear camp could not withstand the attack of the army of the dead, and finally the front line collapsed and blew the horn of retreat and began to flee in all directions, the main force of the coalition forces in the middle camp, which was still struggling to resist the White Walkers, encountered the two-sided attack of the army of the dead. It became a double-sided situation. Therefore, when the Dark Army of the Dead appeared behind the soldiers of the coalition in the middle camp at the dawn, everyone was stunned. Fuck. I couldn't help but swear, and then I was deeply desperate. How did the White Walkers come? Where are the people in the back camp? Seeing the White Walkers suddenly fall from the sky and appear behind the coalition, the brother troops who should have been in the back camp disappeared silently. We were sold out by that old dog Tywin. All the people in the coalition, including the soldiers and nobles, were furious. It's over. We shouldn't have trusted the Lannisters. Deception and filthiness run in their blood. Everyone cursed Tywin Lannister, thinking that this old dog had sold out the army and ran away with his men. Some people even dug up the ancestor of the Lannister family, the clever Lan, and cursed him. It is said that Lan relied on trickery to cheat the Casterly family, the king of Casterly Rock, to get Casterly Rock. This family has cunning genes in its blood. However, despite the curses, the mood of despair is spreading rapidly within the coalition. What should we do? The coalition was able to escape after a defeat and still retained hope. After all, after the fall of the North, the Seven Kingdoms still had half of the country, as well as the Riverlands, the Vale, the Westerlands, the Reach, etc. At worst, they could retreat to Dawn. Dawn is so hot, the Night King should not come. As long as there is hope, the soldiers of the coalition are willing to muster up the courage to fight. However, now that the retreat has been cut off by the White Walkers, most of the soldiers of the coalition, including the nobles, are trapped at the fork of the Green Fork River. Tens of thousands of people are crowded together like lambs to be slaughtered. In front of them are endless whites, on the left is the rushing Green Fork River, and in the back is also the army of the dead. If they all die here, it can be declared that the fall of Westeros is almost just a matter of time. We are surrounded by the White Walkers. We are all going to die here. The mood of despair is also spreading rapidly above the coalition. However, at this moment, Robert Baratheon, the King of the Seven Kingdoms, took the initiative to stand up, holding up the storm hammer in his hand and roaring loudly. Break out. Everyone break out with me. Otherwise, we will all die here. Keep hope. Keep our fire. As the king, Robert stood up in this situation and made a decisive decision to break out. His course still played a very obvious role. The morale of the coalition army, which had been extremely low, was relieved a little. After all, the king was still by their side and did not abandon them and run away alone. Everyone, follow me. We break out to the east. Robert was tall and was very conspicuous among the coalition army riding on a tall horse. He led the soldiers to break out to the east of the battlefield with his warhammer held high. The current battlefield situation was very simple. If they did not want to be driven into the river by the whites, they could only break out to the east, run to the direction of the Bite Bay or hide in the Moon Mountains in the valley, and enter the territory of the High Mountain clan. However, at this moment, Robert suddenly caught a glimpse of a familiar figure in the army of dead coming from behind, and was stunned for a moment. She is Robert Baratheon, who had lost a lot of weight due to the war and pressure during this period, sat on the horse with his eyes widened slightly, with an unbelievable expression on his face, and could not help muttering to himself, "This is impossible." But while Robert was stunned, the female White Walker in the army of dead coming from behind took off the ice longbow without hesitation, then drew the bow and shot an arrow. Puff, a splash of blood splashed out. Robert was stunned and unprepared, and was immediately shot, and fell off his horse. "Your Majesty, Your Majesty." The king was shot, and fell off his horse, and the coalition army instantly became a mess, and Robert seemed to be calling a name, while falling off his horse. The battlefield in the rear fell into a desperate situation. In the distance, the core area of this war, clang, Viserys and the Night King continued to fight, and the long swords collided violently. Then the roar of a giant dragon sounded above his head. Rumble, the overwhelming dragon flame poured down and completely wrapped the two people below. Chapter 420, The Shattered Crown. Rumble flames shot up into the sky. Dragon flames washed over the earth. Viserys was wrestling with the Night King, holding the hilt of his sword tightly with both hands. The helmet on his head was chopped off by the Night King in the fierce battle just now, and no one knew where it flew to. Now his long silver gold hair was scattered on the cold armor. Everywhere Viserys looked was surging dragon flames, and the Night King was also in it. The two fought hard in a sea of fire, and everything in their field of vision became distorted. The silver-haired young man felt warm all over under the dragon flames, and the cold around him was instantly dispelled. The Night King had a completely different experience from him. Although the Night King could also resist the burning of dragon flames, that was the result of consuming divine power. The Night King was stronger than Viserys. After all, he had lived for thousands of years, while Viserys had the help of many external aids. As one side gained strength, while the other lost, Viserys gained the home advantage. In addition, the sky had cleared up, and the warm sunshine tried to penetrate the dark clouds covering the entire battlefield, while the Night King fell into depression. However, at this moment, even though both of them were extraordinary beings, they had already reached the point of exhaustion. Kaka, the silver-haired dragon knight, knelt on one knee on the ground. The scarlet longsword in his hand supported his body. His handsome cheeks were full of fatigue. His chest was heaving, and he was breathing heavily. He raised his head and looked at the Night King not far away. The Night King's condition was also not much better than Viserys. The ancient armor on his body became a little tattered, and there was a shocking scar in it. In the previous battle, Viserys rolled over and picked up the dagger he threw and almost stripped the Night King, who rushed over, but it was a pity that he was still dodged by the Night King. The Night King was standing there shakily with a stone sword in his hand. The ice blue flames in his eyes flickered gently, like a candle in the wind, and the sound of ice cracking came out of his mouth. He raised the stone sword in his hand, as if he was going to attack Viserys. The silver-haired dragon knight who was kneeling on one knee saw this scene, and his eyes couldn't help but condense slightly, and the 5 fingers supporting his body clenched tightly. However, at this moment, the ice crown on the head of the Night King suddenly made a crisp sound. It was like the sound of a fine porcelain breaking, which was particularly clear on the silent battlefield with only 2 people now. The Night King was slightly stunned, and then stopped. Viserys was panting, and he didn't know what happened. Then he saw the Night King stopped, and took off the ice crown with a corner cut off from his head. The translucent ice crown reflected the brilliant light in the sun, and you can see a clear crack in the middle, running through the entire crown. The next second, the ice crown in the Night King's hand completely shattered, turning into crystal light spots like the stars in the sky, falling from the Night King's hand to the ground, and then disappearing without a trace in an instant. The Night King's face instantly became extremely gloomy. The flames in his eyes, like a candle in the wind, began to jump violently, as if burning with a raging anger comparable to dragon flames. Viserys witnessed the whole scene closely, but he didn't know what the shattering of the ice crown meant. He should now be the human in the world who knows the Night King the most, no one else. Because the 2 fought for such a long time, the Night King still didn't kill him. What happened? Why did the ice crown break? Viserys supported the hilt of the sword with one hand, breathing heavily. His brain was thinking quickly, but he couldn't find the answer. But it is certain that Viserys is now at the end of his life. He had already used all the black mist to add to the attributes for fighting, but it was still not enough to break through the 30-point mark of qualitative change. Otherwise Viserys' strength might have jumped to a high level and reached the same height as the Night King. He was now completely pretending with his last breath, hoping to bluff the other party. If the Night King wanted to attack him again, Viserys could only call down Balerion, then turn into black mist and return to the dragon's back to escape. However, at this moment, the ice crown on the Night King's head shattered. The Night King stood there with a gloomy face, saying nothing, and Viserys did not want to provoke him, supporting the hilt of the sword and standing up shakily. But then the Night King, who had stood there for a long time without saying a word, finally raised his head and looked at Viserys, with flames dancing in his eyes. Viserys' heart suddenly tightened, but he held the hilt tightly and stood there, his armor reflecting the fire of the dragon flame, staring at the other party with a sharp look, and he did not seem to be weak. Then, the Night King finally made a sound of cracking ice. The morning sun penetrated the haze of the night, and the snowflakes that had been flying all night finally stopped at this time. But a thick layer of snow had accumulated on the ground, and the frozen Green Fork River showed a little sign of thawing. The voice of the Night King penetrated the battlefield and reached the ears of every White Walker. The kings of the North of all generations were used because of the special blood of the Stark family. Under the power of the Night King, they used bones and Lois to regenerate their bodies and restored their former appearance. Naturally, there was a surreal connection between them. They sat upright on the skeleton horses, and the cold wind blew their grey hair and beards. They heard the Night King's order and looked at the human coalition that was about to be annihilated in front of them. There was no unwillingness in their eyes. Then they turned their horses' heads and retreated in the direction they came from. Countless whites that were crazy and bloodthirsty not long ago have now become extremely obedient under the command of the Night King, silently following the successive kings of the North and heading north. Your Majesty, the main force of the coalition army was surrounded by whites and in a desperate situation. The captain of the King's Guard was holding the body of His Majesty the King. Robert was shot in the right chest. Although he did not die on the spot, he was unconscious and in a critical condition. However, at this extremely critical moment, no one expected that the White Walkers would retreat under such circumstances. What's going on? What happened? Tens of thousands of human soldiers in the main force of the coalition army were surrounded by the White Walkers and were about to be annihilated. Then they watched these dead people passing by them in fear, without attacking them again, but heading north. They were puzzled and didn't know what happened. Could it be that Majesty? However, someone suddenly thought of something. Viserys rode a dragon deep into the back of the army of the dead and never returned. He must have done something. Is the Night King dead? I didn't finish writing the second chapter yesterday. Sorry, I'll find some time to finish it in the afternoon. Chapter 421, Winter Fades Away. Then the surviving coalition soldiers whispered to each other, and he imagined a better future. Impossible. If the Night King is killed, all these whites will die. However, as soon as he spoke, he was opposed. Some of them had seen the death of a White Walker. When a White Walker died, all the whites he transformed into would fall apart directly, and the Night King created all the White Walkers, which belonged to the lifeblood of the entire army of the dead. But no matter what, in the end, the army of the dead retreated again, and all the soldiers and nobles of the coalition saved their lives. They watched the endless whites pass by in front of them, slowly walking towards the north, until their figures gradually disappeared in front of them. Great, we finally survived. Some people couldn't help crying with joy, hugging each other, and others simply lay down in the snow and began to sleep. Hurry up and find a Mr. King Robert Baratheon, who was shot in the right chest, was also put on the ground, and his blood dyed the white snow red. The Maesters who were with the army were hurriedly called over, and were rushing to save the king's life. The king was shot by an arrow, and fell into a coma. Now the coalition army was leaderless. Except for the king, there was no nobleman with weight and ability to take over the position of commander. Eddard Stark, Duke of Winterfell, Stannis, Duke of Dragonstone, and others did not appear here. My lords, I'm not talented enough. Edmure Tully, the heir of Reveron, seemed to be eager to try, but when he stood up in a clean armor holding the hilt of the sword, he was met with silent ridicule from the nobles and shook his head. Edmure's uncle, Brynden Tully, the Bloody Gate Knight wearing the armor of the Vale, did not want to see his nephew being laughed at by the nobles present, so he interrupted him rudely. The young heir of Reveron looked at his uncle and was slightly stunned. It seemed that he had not noticed the smiles on everyone's faces. Then Brynden slightly supported his forehead and spoke helplessly. Sit down. Although Edmure is the heir of the Tully family and the future Lord of Reveron, his father is still alive. As long as he is not the master of the Riverlands, everyone still treats him as a child. Moreover, Edmure's performance in this war is obvious to all. Not only did he fail to interpret the Tully family's motto of family, responsibility, honor, but he also discredited the Tully family. Now, in front of many famous generals of the Seven Kingdoms, he shamelessly recommended himself as the commander-in-chief, which only added to the ridicule. I propose that Lord Barristan Selmy temporarily take over the position of commander-in-chief of the entire army. Then, as the representative of the Vale army, Earlyon Royce of Runestone City proposed that the captain of the King's Guard temporarily take over the position of commander-in-chief. Sir Barristan Selmy has no problems with his ability, identity, and morality, and is more suitable for the position of temporary commander-in-chief of the entire army. More importantly, the White Knights are only loyal to the king, and do not involve the interests of other nobles in the Seven Kingdoms. In this case, they can better convince and unite everyone. Sure enough, Lord Jon Royce's proposal was not opposed by the nobles present. Everyone looked at each other, then nodded and agreed to it. Okay. Agree. I agree. And Barristan Selmy did not refuse or reject it. He took on the responsibility and temporarily took over the position of Commander-in-Chief of His Majesty the King. Thank you for your trust, my lords. Then the grey-haired captain of the King's Guard led the remnants of the coalition army and the seriously injured and unconscious king, and was about to withdraw to the warm south. At this time, snowflakes suddenly flew behind the coalition army. Duke Tywin Lannister, holding high the Golden Lion flag, finally arrived with his army. On the other side of the Green Fork River, far away from the battlefield in the rear, the land where the King of the Dead Army and the Human King fought was repeatedly burned by dragon flames and became charred. The figure of the Night King gradually faded away, and the Dragon Knight in silver armor finally couldn't hold on, and knelt on the ground again. Crack, the bright armor made a sound, reflecting the morning sun. After a night of fierce fighting, the haze in the sky dissipated, as if the clouds had been cleared and the bright sun finally shone on the earth again. Viserys was exhausted. After kneeling on one knee, he simply threw the magic weapon Dusk in his hand aside, and lay directly on the charred land, covered with a layer of snow, forming a big character. And his partner, the Black Dragon Balerion, also fell from the sky, but did not go to chase the Night King. Boom. The dragon fell heavily to the ground, stirring up dust, and its slender neck stretched slightly, and the ferocious dragon head arched Viserys on the ground. Finding that his partner was not dead yet, He raised his hand and made a gesture to let it get out of here quickly, and immediately raised his neck and let out a long roar. There is a unique telepathy between the dragon and its dragon rider. Balerion certainly knew that Viserys was not dead yet, but was just a little exhausted. At this time, a figure was walking slowly towards Viserys in the distance. The red dress and copper-colored hair of the person were fluttering in the wind, and the dress rustled with the smoke and stench of the battlefield. Balerion noticed someone approaching, turned his head slightly, and issued a low warning. But when he saw the appearance of the person, his huge head slowly straightened up, and his scowled eyes locked on the Red Witch below. He did not stop the other party from approaching Viserys, but let her pass directly. The dragon also had a unique sense of humans. He realized that Melisandre had no ill will towards Viserys, and regarded her as one of his own, so he did not make things difficult for her. The red-robed witch who was walking slowly also looked up at the huge monster lying on the ground. The dragon's body exuded an amazing temperature. Balerion fell to the ground, and the snow around him began to melt, and turned into snow water. Melisandre saw that the dragon had no intention of stopping her, and knew that the dragon understood human nature, so she bowed slightly and saluted, then slowly walked towards Viserys. Crash! The silver-armored dragon knight who was lying on the ground pretending to be dead without any image also climbed up from the ground at this moment. Pah! He spat out the scorched earth and snowflakes that Balerion had just dropped and splashed into his mouth. Your Majesty. Melisandre came to Viserys' side. She glanced at the magic weapon dusk thrown on the ground, and then her beautiful eyes fell on Viserys again, and she spoke softly. You repelled the Night King with your own strength, and saved countless lives. Then the Red Witch looked at the place where the Night King left in the distance. This time the cold god retreated, the winter disappeared, and the long summer is coming. I'm afraid that the south of the neck will not make a comeback for at least 5 years. What are your plans next? Chapter 420 to Tywin's wrist. Plans. Viserys stood up from the ground and patted the dust off his body. Then he bent down to pick up the dusk that he had thrown aside, and then pointed the tip of the sword at the scabbard on his waist and put it back. Clang. The blade rubbed against the sword guard and made a sound. Viserys gripped the hilt, then raised his head and spoke. I don't have any plans now. I just want to lie down and have a good sleep. The face of the silver-haired young man was full of fatigue. A night of fierce fighting was indeed very exhausting for him, even though he had now entered the extraordinary existence. Who told you what you just said? Was it the revelation given to you by the Lord of Light? Viserys asked, and Melisandre shook her head slightly and raised her hand to welcome a ray of sunlight. No, I felt it myself. The silver-haired young man was slightly startled. Then he also felt the warmth carried by the sunlight. In the late winter and early spring, the morning breeze was moist, and the whole world suddenly became full of vitality. Winter left with the footsteps of the Night King, and the spring breeze quietly blew across the land. The nightmare had passed, and hope finally became a reality. I don't know why Viserys suddenly felt a little melancholy. Looking back on the day he came into this world until now, it was like a bad dream. Then he sighed inexplicably, and cursed in a rare low voice. Fuck. Time flies. The Targaryen family lost the Iron Throne in the last strong spring, and returned to their homeland in this spring. It can be regarded as a kind of fateful reincarnation. At this time, the rumbling of horse hooves sounded in the distance, dust and snowflakes flew, and the Dothraki led by Cargo rushed over from afar. After the war, the cavalry of the Seven Kingdoms had left Cargo's leadership under the leadership of Stannis and Eddard Stark, and took another completely different route to the south, to cross the river and return to the twins. They didn't know that the twins had fallen, and Robert had been shot and fainted, but it was definitely not a good choice to stay with this group of fierce grassland warriors. After all, they were enemies, not friends, and they only united briefly, because of the pressure of the White Walkers. Stannis and Eddard were very clear about this. Then, rumble, the horses galloped, the dust flew, and the earth trembled slightly. However, the Dothraki who came in a menacing manner came to Viserys, but did not stop. Instead, they surrounded him, and the Red Witch, holding up their axe and cheering harshly. Roar, roar, roar. Viserys, who was surrounded, seemed very calm. He just smiled and nodded, because he knew that this was a unique celebration ceremony of the Dothraki. Then Cargo urged his horse out from the cheering tribesmen. He came to Viserys and the Red Witch, then turned over and knelt on one knee. Blood of my blood. The warm spring breeze blew across the twins. The coalition of the 7 nations has retreated to this castle that was briefly occupied by the White Walkers. They killed all the whites left here and burned their bodies. Many of them were descendants and servants of the Free family, and they were almost wiped out. The family of the Lord of the Crossing was also the most unlucky family in this war, and there was no other family. The ancestor of the family, Lord Walder Free, was frightened and jumped into the river to commit suicide. Later, the Free family was also raided by the White Walkers. Once one of the richest and most powerful families in the Trident River Basin, the Free family was prosperous and large in size, but it suffered heavy casualties in this war. Only a few outstanding descendants who were sent overseas by Old Walder in advance were left, and many descendants died in the battles. The eldest son of the new Marquis of the twins, Stevran Free, was killed, and the new Marquis was grief-stricken. The children of the Free family who stayed in the twins were all dead, and they all became fresh whites, and were burned by fire. The temporary commander of the coalition army was originally the captain of the King's Good, Sir Barristan Selmy, but the situation changed after Lord Tywin led his troops to the city. Many nobles may have been favored by Lord Tywin and lent him gold, so they turned to support the Duke of Casterly Rock without saying a word. Many soldiers of the coalition army suspected that they had been betrayed by Tywin before, but they dared not speak out when they were surrounded by the newly supported Westerly army. However, the upright Lord Jon Royce of Runestone was not frightened by the Westerly army, but took the initiative to stand up. He asked Lord Tywin Lannister face to face why he retreated before the battle and betrayed his allies. Tywin's withdrawal directly put the lords of the coalition army and His Majesty the King in danger, and they were almost wiped out by the White Walkers. Even the Lord of Runestone threw the blame for the king being shot on Tywin's head. In the alliance of Wolf, Deer, and Osprey, the mainstay of the Baratheon dynasty, only Earlyon Royce, the representative of the Vale, has the ability to stand up in the face of this situation. The Duke of the Eyrie, Jon Arryn, is dead. The Duke of Riverrun, Hoster Tully, is seriously ill and did not come. The Duke of Winterfell, Eddard Stark, is not at the scene. The king of the Baratheon family is in a coma, and the king's eldest brother and Eddard did not return. Unfortunately, his remaining teammates are all rotten fish and shrimp, so that when the Earl of Runestone City took the initiative to stand up and question Tywin in person, hoping to resolve the current dilemma, unexpectedly, no noble in the Wolf, Deer, and Osprey alliance dared to stand up to support him. Only Jon Royce, wearing bronze armor, stood alone in the same place, facing Tywin's gloomy face. Tywin was attacked by the Earl of Runestone City, accusing him of betraying the king and the interests of the coalition. Faced with such a heinous crime, Tywin naturally denied it. Otherwise, even if he had 3 heads, they would not be enough to chop off, and he would even become a public enemy. However, since he had been confronted by the other party, Tywin had to give a positive explanation for this thorny problem. Then the Duke of Casterly Rock, with a gloomy face, explained in front of all the nobles and soldiers why he took the initiative to withdraw his troops, trying to save his reputation. According to Duke Tywin, he actually reported the bad news to the king as soon as he received it. However, for some reason, the messenger lost his trace and did not pass the news to the king. Not only was he not guilty of dereliction of duty and failure in the battle, but as the commander of the rear, he also blocked the White Walkers for at least several hours for the main force of the coalition. During this period, he sent people to ask the king for help many times, but did not see any reinforcement. Therefore, he was forced to withdraw his troops. Chapter 423, Hidden Arrows are hard to guard against. It is unknown how many people really listened to Tywin's explanation. At least the missing messengers could not stand up to prove it for him. But with a burst of sparse applause, Tywin still squeezed out the captain of the King's Good, who had no political influence, through his own wrist, and temporarily became the commander of the coalition. It seems reasonable that the king's father-in-law replaced the injured and comatose king as the commander of the entire army. After all, they are all family members, and the King's Good is still an outsider after all, no matter how loyal they are. Therefore, Tywin led the rear formation and the new reinforcement from the west, and easily dismissed Barristan Selmy. The other party was the commander for less than an hour, and then became a senior bodyguard again. The coalition returned to the twins under the command of Duke Tywin to recuperate, and then the Seven Kingdoms cavalry returning from the front brought another good news. This time the White Walkers retreated thoroughly, and it seems that they will not come back for a while. The Maesters who followed the army also noticed the change in temperature, and predicted that winter had passed, and a new round of spring had arrived. The last spring was the wrong spring in the year 281 of the Conquest era. The retreat of the White Walkers was like the collapse of a mountain that weighed on everyone's hearts. The crisis of doomsday disappeared, the haze above their heads dissipated, and everyone felt that their breathing became smoother. Some people even proposed to hold a grand celebration banquet and a tournament in the twins to celebrate this moment of victory. After all, this has been the case for so many years. His Majesty is also fond of grandiose success and spends money like water, and the vassals below are willing to cater to him. If His Majesty the King had not been shot and fell off his horse and fell into a coma, perhaps he would really invite that king and the Dothraki to hold a celebration banquet and a tournament to commemorate the sincere feelings of the two sides fighting side by side. After the two sides celebrated with wine and chat, whether it was a tense situation or sitting down to negotiate was a matter for the future. But defeating the White Walkers must be a pleasure worth drinking a few glasses of wine. If King Robert had not fallen into a coma, such a thing might have really happened with his temperament. But unfortunately, there is no if in this world, and Robert was still unconscious on the hospital bed. As the commander of the entire army, Tywin had a pair of green eyes that were meticulous. His style of commanding the army was to enforce discipline, and he hated drinking and having fun in the army. Therefore, he mercilessly rebuked the fool who came up with this idea, and told him in a stern tone that defeating the White Walkers did not mean complete victory, because they still had stronger enemies waiting for them. Tywin's words were like a basin of cold water poured on people's heads, making them completely sober from the joy of victory. Who is the stronger enemy? Everyone knows without Tywin's explanation. The enemy who can repel the Night King will naturally be a stronger enemy, and he still has a large number of soldiers on the other side of the narrow sea who have not landed in Westeros. However, although Tywin's words extinguished everyone's joy and made everyone nervous again, they were still not as nervous as facing the White Walkers as a whole. Because no matter how terrible Viserys and his grassland cavalry are, at least they are still human beings. Since they are human beings, they can still communicate, but the White Walkers don't even give them room for communication. If they really can't resist the Targaryen family's army that swallows up Westeros in the future, they can just kneel down and surrender. At that time, there will be no psychological burden, and it will not affect the family honor. What's more, the coalition and Viserys have not completely turned against each other. Therefore, although Tywin poured a basin of cold water, the overall atmosphere of the coalition is still mainly relaxed and active. But there are still two people in the entire army of the twins who feel a little worried. One of them is Eddard Stark, the Duke of Winterfell, and the other is Stannis Baratheon, the king's eldest brother. The two are also brothers in distress. They only have the title of the Guardian of the North and the Duke of Dragonstone, but they have no territory. They followed the Dothraki to go deep behind the enemy's back and rush the White Walkers, so they knew how terrible the grassland knights under Viserys were. And they also witnessed the power of the dragon up close, and they were worried about the future. It would be fine if they didn't turn against Viserys. If they really did, they would have no chance of winning. Moreover, after the two men returned with their army, they first went to see Robert Baratheon, who was in a coma. They were originally qualified to be the commander-in-chief of the entire army. One was the king's most trusted good brother, the next designated hand of the king, and the other was the king's own brother. They also had considerable support within the coalition. But because of Robert's absence, when he fell into a coma, the best opportunity was missed, allowing Tywin to occupy the position of commander-in-chief, and it became even more difficult to seize power. At this time, the horn on the top of the twins suddenly sounded. Woo! The melodious and desolate horn sound quickly spread throughout the sky. The soldiers of the coalition and the nobles of the 7 countries came out one after another. It turned out that the Dothraki army appeared at the end of the horizon, so the horn was blown. Rumble, the sound of horses' hooves rumbled, the ground trembled slightly, and the endless Dothraki army first appeared in the sight of the allied soldiers like a gust of wind sweeping away the flying grass, and then in the blink of an eye it was in front of them. The Dothraki arrived at the twins, separated by the rushing river and the towering suspension bridge. The stone arch bridge of the twins was protected by two castles, towering walls, deep moats, and heavy oak and iron-studded wooden doors. Viserys was still wearing a Valyrian steel armor, riding a white horse, and walking at the forefront of the array. Then he reined in his warhorse, and looked at the top of the twins. He saw Tywin Lannister, Eddard Stark, and Stannis, but he didn't see Robert. Viserys frowned slightly, then held the reins with one hand under the city and asked, "Where's Robert? Tell him to come out and see me." However, at this moment, the sound of a giant crossbow being fired suddenly burst out from the walls of the twins. Bang! A spear suddenly flew out, making a sharp sound of breaking through the air at a very fast speed, and pierced directly at Viserys, who was riding a white horse under the wall. Viserys under the city raised his eyebrows, and a pair of lavender eyes flickered slightly. Then he suddenly pulled out the dusk from his waist, and slightly turned sideways in the direction of the spear. Then he split the flying giant crossbow in half with a sword. However, at this moment, the painful roar of a giant dragon suddenly came from the sky above. Dozens of huge crossbow arrows were suddenly fired from the top of the twins, one of which hit Balerian's chest, and dragon blood spilled on the ground. Chapter 424 Excuse. Roar. Balerian was shot, but the wound was not deep. The dragon roared, and its huge wings vibrated. Then a raging dragon flame was sprayed at the location where the crossbow arrow hit, melting it directly into ashes on its body. Then it shook the thick scales on its body slightly, and black mist suddenly rose from the wound, and began to repair its body, just like the last time he was injured in a fight with a demonized dragon. But compared to the last time he fought a dragon that was even bigger than him, this small injury was just like being pricked by a needle. Someone in the coalition might think that the crossbow could snipe the dragon and Viserys, but the result was counterproductive. Instead of killing Balerian, it angered the Black Death, and Viserys also shattered the crossbow arrow with a sword in the air. The reason why Viserys dared to rush his horse to the city alone was that he knew that, even if the other party had any tricks, he could not be hurt. He even had some intention of deliberately luring the other party to attack him, but in fact, he was 120% more vigilant in his heart. Because now he needed an excuse to turn against the other party, and this excuse was presented to him, and in front of countless allied soldiers, he tried to attack them from behind. It was natural and reasonable for Viserys to retaliate. Roar. Balerian's roar made the twins tremble. Then the huge figure that covered the sky and the sun swooped down, and the overwhelming dragon flames poured down. Rumble. The dragon flames madly hit the walls of the twins, and countless allied soldiers screamed, and were directly burned to ashes. Some soldiers were burning with flames, and then jumped off the wall, and died under the city, or jumped into the water, but drowned in the Green Fork. The soldiers of the allied forces survived the nightmare of the invasion of the White Walkers, but they did not expect to be buried in the dragon flames, because of the fickleness of human hearts. The nobles of the Seven Kingdoms on the wall, including Tywin Lannister, who was now acting as the commander of the coalition forces, naturally fled from the wall in a hurry under the escort of the guards. Protect the Lord. Quickly retreat. In fact, when the crossbow arrow hit Balerian, but failed to kill the dragon, they knew that something was wrong. If it was a step later, it would probably be burned to ashes by the dragon flame. Who gave the order? Why attack the dragon? The man with the dire wolf emblem on his chest and dark brown hair also fell into a rage. He hurriedly walked down the wall under the escort of the northern soldiers, and ran into Tywin Lannister, the acting commander of the coalition forces. Then Eddard Stark, the Duke of Winterfell, strode forward and grabbed Tywin by the collar, asking angrily. Clang, clang. The Lannister family soldiers behind Tywin saw their lord being threatened by the other side by the collar, and immediately drew their swords and spoke loudly. Stop. Let go of Lord Tywin. The soldiers of the Westerlands drew their swords one after another, and the soldiers of the north who followed Eddard Stark were naturally not afraid either. What are you doing? Although their armor was not as luxurious as that of the Westerland soldiers, they were more fiery and brave, so they also drew their swords one after another. The scene was instantly filled with swords and the scene suddenly became tense. Tywin, who was grabbed by Eddard Stark by the collar, also looked a little unhappy. Such an action was a very rude behavior and might even lead to a duel. Eddard was usually arrogant and indifferent, but he rarely had such rude moments. It seemed that he was also very angry now. Tywin didn't know Eddard's background, but when he thought of the other party's record of killing Arthur Dayne, the Sword of the Dawn, he immediately became timid. He was old and didn't want to fight with young people. Therefore, Tywin suffered a great humiliation, but for now he could only swallow his anger and try to talk to the furious Eddard Stark calmly. "Lord Eddard, can you let me go first?" Tywin looked at the Duke of Winterfell with his eyes and then spoke. The dark brown-haired man also looked at him, took a deep breath, and finally reason overcame impulse. He didn't want to start an internal conflict when there was an external enemy. Then Eddard suddenly let go of Tywin's collar, giving the Duke of Casterly Rock a chance to breathe. My lord. My lord." The guards hurriedly supported the somewhat embarrassed Duke Tywin. Tywin Lannister waved his hand slightly, took a few deep breaths, adjusted the collar that had just been grabbed, and then spoke in a hoarse voice. "Lord Eddard, do you think that, if we don't attack Viserys, he will let us go?" Tywin's words calmed Eddard, who was still furious just now, down a lot. "You, Jon Arryn, Hoster Tully, and His Majesty, the Coalition of the North, the Vale, the Riverlands, and the Stormlands overthrew the dynasty ruled by his father and drove the Targaryen family from the Iron Throne. My hands are also stained with the blood of the Targaryen family." Tywin's eyes were bright, and he took the initiative to walk in front of Eddard Stark again. This made the northern soldiers standing behind the Duke of Winterfell nervous, and then Tywin continued to ask, "And now he's back?" The slightly bald blonde man pointed outside. "Do you think he will let us go?" Eddard was completely silent. He just came directly on impulse. He even had some expectations in his heart that he could try not to conflict with Viserys and solve the problem through peace talks. He was even willing to wear black clothes as the chief culprit in exchange for Viserys not attacking Westeros. However, it seems that this road has been blocked from the beginning, and it is even a little naive. "So what? Lord Tywin, you used a dishonorable method to attempt to stab someone, and what did you get in the end?" Eddard asked back, after he calmed down. Although he did not approve of stabbing someone, he did it. However, it was a bit embarrassing that he did not kill the opponent. Boom. The flames above his head shot up into the sky, and the dragon flames spewed on the walls of the twins. A large number of allied soldiers screamed, and the two people below also changed color. "This is my negligence, Lord Eddard. I thought the giant crossbow could snipe the dragon, because the Dornishman shot Merryx's at the Hellgate, which is the only way to deal with the dragon." Looking at the surging dragon flames above his head, Tywin Lannister's face changed slightly, and then he spoke. He knew that Viserys would never let him go, so he had to take the initiative and surround the allied forces tightly on his left and right. It was for this reason that he secretly instructed the soldiers to fire the giant crossbow to try to snipe Viserys and his dragon. But unfortunately, the crossbow did not do much damage to Balerion. Unless he was hit directly in the eye like Merryx's, it was just like tickling, which angered the dragon. What Tywin did not expect was that Viserys could break the crossbow arrow with one sword. Is he still a human? Now is the best chance to defeat Viserys. Otherwise, when his 3 dragons and 60,000 troops have all crossed the narrow sea, we will have no chance at all. I didn't finish writing the second chapter yesterday. Sorry, I will finish it this morning. Chapter 425 Tywin's Plan. Tywin's words were not without reason, and Eddard had completely calmed down at this moment, but the biggest problem at hand was not how to make the reason clear, but what to do with the dragon above his head. Boom. Then there was another loud noise, and there was a dragon's earth-shaking roar in the sky. The dragon was venting its anger to its heart's content, and its roar made the twins tremble. In addition to the strategic materials hidden in the cellar, all the giant crossbows placed on the city wall had been burned by the dragon's flames. The soldiers of the coalition also suffered heavy casualties. Some were directly burned to death, or jumped off the city wall and jumped into the river in an attempt to survive. After losing the only weapon that could threaten the dragon, the counterattack organized by the coalition soldiers seemed a little weak against the mythical beast of the dragon. Screams rang out, and flames continued to pour down. Archers! Archers! Lambert Talha, Earl of Toland Square City, lay on the parapet in a mess, his face blackened by the thick smoke. He looked at the flying figure of the dragon above his head, then waved and shouted loudly, "Archers, come here." The surrounding coalition archers all gathered when they heard the Earl's order. Many of the coalition soldiers were temporarily captured, mainly refugees from the north and the Riverlands. But after experiencing the war with the White Walkers, they have become veterans at this moment. Raise your bows. Then, with the Earl's order, all the coalition archers drew their bows and arrows, raised them up, and aimed at the dragon that was constantly circling and spitting flames in the sky. Balerion swooped down in this direction again, carrying an unstoppable force, and the roar of the dragon shook the eardrums. Shit. The facial muscles of Lambert Talha, the Earl of Torrent Square City, twisted in fear, swallowed a mouthful of saliva slightly, and then roared loudly, "Kill this beast for me. Shoot." Bang, bang, bang. In an instant, the bowstrings made dense sounds, and countless arrows flew straight to the swooping dragon. Balerion roared again in the face of the overwhelming rain of arrows, showing no fear. Ding ding dang dang, countless arrows fell on Balerion's hard scales, making a metallic collision sound, but they did not break through the defense at all, but were directly bounced out, and fell to the ground. Then the dragon slightly opened its huge mouth, and a dazzling red light appeared in the depths of its throat. The faces of the Earl of Torrent Square City, Lambert Talhut, and many of the coalition archers below showed despair. The next second, rumble, the overwhelming dragon flames poured down. Earl Lambert Talhut and many of the coalition soldiers screamed miserably, their bodies twisted under the surging dragon flames, and they turned into charred corpses in an instant. Then Balerion's figure rose again, swept over the city wall, and flew into the sky with a strong wind. Now the soldiers of the coalition finally experienced what the White Walkers and Dothraki experienced when facing the dragon. The other party was flying in the sky and spewing fire non-stop. The people below were anxious, but could do nothing. Moreover, ordinary arrows and crossbows had no effect on the thick scales of the dragon. This was the case when Balerion was still young, and at best a young dragon, but his size was much larger than his age. There was no limit to the growth of a dragon in its life. It would continue to grow with its age, and its scales would become thicker and rougher than steel. Even the crossbows fired by the giant crossbows could not cause any harm to it. At that time, the dragon would truly become the overlord of the sky that no one could threaten. The wall was like a purgatory on earth, with surging dragon flames and billowing gunpowder smoke everywhere. And below the castle, crash, the rubble and dust on the ceiling above fell down together, and the people under the castle were covered in dust. So, what should we do now? The upright northerners actually agreed with Tywin's point of view in their hearts, but they did not agree with Tywin's way of doing things. If he really wants to defeat Viserys, now is the best opportunity. Otherwise, when his 3 dragons and 60,000 troops cross the narrow sea, nothing can stop him. Tywin patted the dust on his body in a somewhat embarrassed manner, listened to the roar of the dragon above his head, raised his head, and looked at the ceiling of the castle. His eyes were solemn, and he took a deep breath and spoke. Bravos. Believe me, Lord Eddard, Bravos is one of the forces in the world that least wants to see the Targaryen family rise again. When the Targaryen family was at its lowest, Bravos lent them a hand. However, now the Targaryen family has a huge army and dragons, and has been supported by the people of Pentos, and will even challenge Bravos' position in the trading city-state. There is probably a proverb in the free trade city-state that describes this situation. No one wants someone who was once weaker than themselves to climb on their head. For the people of Bravos, this real threat is right in front of him, and he can't help but pay attention to the Targaryen. Bravos? Eddard Stark frowned deeply when he heard Tywin's words. Lord Tywin, how did you get in touch with Bravos? In fact, as one of the oldest and most long-standing nobles in the history of Westeros, the Stark family is very traditional. This is reflected in Eddard, who has a persistent adherence to honor and a fair and strict style of doing things, and rarely takes the initiative to contact external forces. Remember the messenger from the Iron Bank? Tywin shook his head and said. Eddard suddenly realized that there has always been an envoy from the Iron Bank following the army in this war, named Tycho Nestor. He is also Robert's god of wealth. The Iron Bank has provided a lot of low interest or even interest-free loans to help the coalition stop the White Walkers. It seems that Tywin has contacted Bravos through the other party at some point. But Bravos is beyond our reach after all. Eddard frowned slightly and still spoke. Bravos is thousands of miles away from the twins. Even if Tywin has already contacted them, Bravos is willing to form an alliance with the Iron Throne. But when the news reaches the Sea King's palace and then comes back, the Bravos invincible fleet is dispatched, and it is estimated that everyone's bodies are already cold. I have also sent people to contact the Golden Company in advance, and Tywin still seems to be confident. It seems that he has already made a plan. It is definitely not a temporary decision made today. These mercenaries only recognize gold, not honor and responsibility. As long as we promise them high interest, I guarantee they will be tempted. Then we will directly capture the daughter of Rhaegar and threaten Viserys to withdraw. On Dragonstone, thick smoke rose from the crater, and the figure of the dragon shuttled through the smoke. The Targaryen army was stationed on Dragonstone and Tidehead, and the flags fluttered in the wind. At this time, the heavily guarded Unsullied soldiers opened the gate of the castle. The commander of the Golden Company, Maes Toyne, hurriedly entered the castle with a person. Your Highness, we have caught a spy. End of this chapter. Thank you very much for reaching the end. Don't forget to like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription, or donation encourages us to continue. Thanks to everyone. See you in the next video.